At the ball, where crowns and smiles glittered, Duchess Rosaline saw a wounded beastman in a gilded cage, living proof of her friend's betrayal. She had no idea that the slave she saved would become her curse, her love, and the one to bring her to her knees before her own past. Subscribe. Your like keeps me creating. The city basked beneath the glow of the setting sun, with a noble manor nestled quietly beside the blossoming gardens. The guests had already assembled, eager to exchange the freshest tidbits of scandal. The heart of every rumor inevitably pointed to a single woman. Rosaline Idris Appledon, sister to the Emperor and the Empire's solitary Grand Duchess. Rosaline found comfort amidst knights still clad in their armor and sweat. At one time, she abandoned gowns for trousers, a blade affixed to her hip. Inside the opulent house, the aristocrats exchanged whispers. One remarked dryly, "Oh my, that illustrious duchess?" After all, surely the royals weren't commoners apt to keep enslaved paramours, now were they? Some called him a brute, a blot on the royal reputation. The very thought of sharing a bed with a slave seemed bizarre and bred mistrust. Aroused by curiosity, they pressed for the truth, only for their animated conversation to cease at the sharp clap of a gentleman capturing all eyes. The imposing figure smilingly, yet admonishingly, drew attention to the princess's celebratory ball. He further hinted that the elusive duchess herself would be present that evening, quietly encouraging his peers towards manners. Shadows spilled silver over the castle turrets, while the starlit, cloud-speckled night unfolded, heralding the princess's natal celebration. The radiant feast hall shimmered with joy, each guest celebrating, brimming with sincere admiration and benedictions for the princess. Suddenly, hushed excitement swept through the assembled nobles as a long-awaited figure appeared among the gathering. She glided forward into the ballroom, a vision, her slippers crystalline, as if born from myth, a stunning sapphire gown cascading to the floor. Her unfolding tresses shone with the brilliance of sunlight on pure gold, and those nearby gazed on, spellbound and breathless. Grand Duchess Rosaline Idris Appledon entered into their midst, her splendor rooting every gaze to her form. Confident in her stride as hushed voices pondered the expanse of velvet bearing the back of her elegant dress, Rosaline faced their stares with poise. Undeterred, those present muttered remarks regarding the Duchess's taste in exotic, and to them improper, foreign attire. Accompanying Rosaline was a dusky-skinned stranger, garbed in sapphire, an unfamiliar presence none could recall seeing before. Arm in arm with her companion, Rosaline stirred guesses. Was this indeed the rumored servant? His lack of distinguishing marks left some uncertain. Soft speculation threaded the room. Some debated his origins, wondering at which house might claim him, while others insisted he was surely a servant and perhaps an old family retainer. The crowd speculated. Could the Duchess truly have brought a servant to this grand occasion, despite contrary beliefs? Rosaline's escort displayed a look of clear discomfort. Rosaline watched him with her amber gaze, a restrained amusement flickering in her glimmering eyes. The youth sharply told her to wipe the smile from her face, but Rosaline simply dismissed his words. He insisted, demanding she refrain from grinning, even in her thoughts. She responded with a defiant smile, remarking to herself that within her own mind, she made the rules, further explaining that she had no interest in men who attempted to meddle. Fenlier, wary of the glances and whispers, was evidently uneasy. Rosaline continued to gaze at him with a gentle, yet lupine smile, her intention unreadable. Laying a reassuring hand on his shoulder, she announced she would go face the king and that he might remain in the corridor. His startled reply was, "By yourself?" Rosaline turned toward him, her words laced with dry humor, as though she already knew. "Are you going to accompany me, then?" The man, his lips pressed in clear displeasure and a faint suggestion of anxiety, retorted that he would have to decline. Rosaline had expected nothing else. She suggested he take refuge on the opulent balcony to escape tiresome conversation and unsolicited prying, promising him that with the curtains closed, he would enjoy a little seclusion. The Duchess softly rested her hand on his chest, lifting her gaze to his. With an affection that bordered on tenderness, she reassured him she would soon return. Fenrir, turning his eyes downward, reluctant to be left adrift among strangers, quietly acquiesced. The moment Rosaline had stepped away, every attendee's attention landed on her companion, testing Fenrir's composure with a wave of renewed agitation. Braving the onlookers' curiosity, he did his utmost to maintain composure, striding with resolve to the balcony just as Rosaline had suggested. Lost in his own reflections, he moved out onto the balcony, taking a cooling breath, realizing that his outward front weighed him down more than expected. In a swift and decisive motion, he drew close the heavy crimson drapes. Nobles milling near the glass regarded his action with a flicker of notice. Now separated from the festivities, Fenrir no doubt breathed easier. For once, concealed from the scrutiny of the court, he was truly on his own. Bathed in moonlight, tranquility settled upon him, and it softened the lines of his expression. Fenrir let his attention wander across the noble garden, a wineglass in hand. He murmured, "Now we can relax." The imperial garden shimmered with refined splendor, lantern light gracefully illuminating the dignified trees as the stately evening unfolded. While immersed in the natural beauty of the night, Fenrir found his thoughts wandering back to a recent exchange. He remembered Rosaline, playful and bold atop him in scarlet nightwear, remarking how guests would keep to themselves during the young princess's birthday celebration. With a romantic sweep, the Duchess drew him close, mentioning that on typical occasions there was often someone concealed in the garden, indulging in all manner of questionable behavior. With a loving gesture, Rosaline's fingers trailed along the base of his neck, stopping at the mark that bore witness to their passionate encounter. Thinking back, Fenrir placed a hand over the cherry-colored imprint on his throat, quietly grumbling, "Rosaline really has a talent for mischief." Solitude was not his companion for long, for a gentle inquiry broke the silence from behind. "What's that?" Surprise instantly flickered across Fenrir's face. Peering out from behind the curtains, a girl dressed in yellow, the daughter of nobility, regarded Fenrir with lively green eyes brimming with intrigue. An uncertain hush descended while their eyes locked, thick with Fenrir's unease and the maiden's curiosity. Fenrir restlessly scratched the back of his head, small beads of sweat glimmering on his brow. He pondered about the origin of the unexpected young lady. The inquisitive noble maiden, keen to discover more, inquired about the object held in the youth's grasp. Fenrir, taken aback by her interest, stalled before answering. Eager to sample the contents, the girl pressed him by asking if it was a spirit or merely a mundane beverage. Knowing exactly what filled the cup, Fenrir denied her sternly. Upon being refused, the diminutive girl gripped the curtain's edge and offered Fenrir a soulful gaze, softly querying if sampling was absolutely forbidden. Fenrir was entirely unprepared, amazed at her boldness, and left somewhat overwhelmed by her unpredictable demeanor. Yielding to the girl's unwavering resolve, Fenrir surrendered his glass to her. The girl offered her gratitude with practiced courtesy. With lively enthusiasm, the girl bravely tasted the drink for the very first time. The cup was almost comically large in her delicate grasp. In an instant, her expression soured as unfamiliar displeasure overtook her features. It was clear she had imagined a different outcome from the unknown drink. Just as she was about to question Fenrir about the flavor, the girl's nanny, having caught up, anxiously called out upon seeing her charge alone with a stranger. Sitting beside her, the nanny administered a gentle scolding, warning never to accept things from unfamiliar people, and advising the girl to always consult her. Fenrir watched on, clearly uneasy. Cradled in her caretaker's arms, the child tried to express her belief. Drinks served to princes of distant realms must differ. The nanny listened but responded with a strict gaze. Fenrir, hearing this declaration, was bewildered by her mistake. The realization that the girl believed him a prince left him mystified. Wearing a mask of pride, the nanny quickly escorted her inquisitive ward indoors. Fenrir was left with no chance to correct her misconception. He stood watching the retreating pair, dwelling on the little girl's remark. The perplexity etched across his features showed his fascination about being identified as royalty. Peering over her guardian's shoulder, the young noblewoman bestowed a gentle, parting smile upon Fenrir, bidding her newfound friend farewell. Fenrir lingered for their departure, rubbing his head again as he struggled to make sense of the strange occurrence. Thoughts interrupted, he heard the lively commotion and animated chatter drifting from the banquet hall. News of the girl's claim that Fenrir was a prince furnished the nobles with a convincing reason for his unique appearance, and they promptly began to conjecture in earnest. Letting a tired sigh escape, Fenrir laid a hand atop his head and closed his eyes, worried that these events had only seeded new confusion around him. Without his noticing, Rosaline quietly stepped onto the balcony. With an air of serenity, she asked him if the young lady who had just left seemed agreeable. Holding her own glass and smiling, the Duchess explained with warmth that this spirited young woman was none other than her niece, Melody. Fenrir replied that Melody had mistaken him for royalty, to which Rosaline replied with a bright laugh. It was all due to her influence. Everyone was intrigued by his persona. That only deepened Fenrir's uncertainty. The Duchess went on to share that, in her own fable, her guest was presumed to be a fugitive prince, wrongly censured for seeking accession to the throne, who had sought sanctuary within their empire. Above their heads, countless stars shimmered, lighting the palace and the verdant foliage with a silver glow as Rosaline's voice carried on. In Rosaline's tale, Fenrir had plotted to seize power from his own uncle by instigating a coup. Only then may he retrieve his crown and journey back to his homeland, dispelling every erroneous charge lodged against him. The young lady revealed she planned to join forces with the prince, but would remain incognito so the empire's stake would remain secret. Fenrir was taken aback. When Rosaline concluded her tale, she stood tall with pride. Fenrir marveled at how she had found the time to create it, though the girl sensed the root of his amazement. Aiming to comfort him, Rosaline enveloped Fenrir in a gentle embrace, peacefully reassuring him there was nothing for him to fear. She added serenely that Melody was a clever soul and would not be convinced that Fenrir was a true prince. The girl simply enjoyed indulging her imagination. In a dejected tone, Fenrir voiced his worry that should Melody uncover the truth about his origins, it might leave her feeling unsettled. Rosaline stepped back, worry creasing her forehead, assuring him that Melody bore resemblance to her, and just as Rosaline accepted Fenrir, so too would Melody never think ill of him. With a softness, the Duchess cradled his hand, gently reminding him he was never meant to live as a captive. Moonbeams woven in silver heightened the enchantment of the moment. Rosaline's passionate kiss brushed his lips as she looped her arms round his neck, shocking Fenrir, who nonetheless responded in kind. A gentle kiss, laden with feeling and longing, lingered sweetly on both their mouths. The stunned nobles were beside themselves. It stretched their credulity that the Duchess might stage such an act on all witnesses, especially with so much gossip at her heels. An abashed Fenrir caught all the watching eyes upon them, while Rosaline's joy sparkled, satisfaction mingled with a subtle jealousy. Her soothing words chilled Fenrir's anxieties, a tender smile blossomed on his lips, and with a loving caress she stroked his cheek. Remaining close to Fenrir's side, Rosaline revealed that her reason for appearing at the festival was complete. She had offered her greeting to the Emperor, just as she intended. Beneath the moon's argent halo, the two of them shimmered like fabled shadows. With warmth in her voice, Rosaline invited him to return to their dwelling. Fenrir clasped the gentle hand, caressing him, admitting how dearly he cherished the sound of her speaking the word home. Glorious under the waxing lunar light, the palace watched Rosaline and Fenrir taking their leave. Once within the tranquility of their manor, the Duchess and Fenrir readied themselves for repose after such a vivid, memorable feast. Rosaline softly let her hand trail across the downy pelt, eager to show endearment with each stroke. A moment later, bewilderment seized her, and she withdrew her hand, perplexity coloring her features. Fenlir, in his beastly form lost in peaceful slumber, was roused by her touch and fixed his luminous yellow eyes upon her. Rosaline courteously apologized for stirring him. Not missing a beat, she resumed gently petting him like a domestic feline. The young woman sought her bed, ready to welcome pleasant dreams, though by then, intention gleamed in Fenrir's gaze. In a breath, Fenrir reclaimed his human form, resting his hand beside Rosaline's to catch her awareness. He leaned forward, clearly wishful to act. The Duchess's eyes questioned his intent as she waited with quiet anticipation. The youth drew nearer, delicately cupping Rosaline's chin, eager to linger admiring her grace before leaning in for a gentle kiss. Silver moonbeams spilled across the lavish chamber of the manor, and the two souls lingered on the threshold of an unspoken delight. Fenrir's broad fingers traced the edge of the girl's nightgown, pausing at its fabric's end. She took his hand and moved it away from her leg, leaving Fenrir with a look of confusion. Radiating affection and gentleness, Rosaline softly embraced the man. In a tender voice, she murmured, "Let us simply rest in this embrace." Fenrir wore an expression of uncertainty, for he had harbored hopes for a rather different result. The Duchess reclined with a hint of shyness, yet she immersed herself in the gentle solace found with her beloved. Composed now, the girl's face softened, as she wished Fenrir a peaceful night. Longing to caress the man's back, Rosaline hesitated, tracing the many marks that mapped his skin. Sorrow clouded her gaze, and each brush of his scars called forth memories of their first encounter and the echoes of former days. Within the city, there stands the stonework Green Manor, adorned with its fountain and lush greenery, a title that only heightens its elegance. It rises with fairy tale grandeur above the nearby woods, acknowledged as the most venerable among the imperial estates. Though none chose to dwell there forever, the estate hosted many. For years, it belonged to the emperor alone. The lone exception was a woman named Rosaline Idris Appledon, graced with the honor of Grand Duchess. A maid entered Rosaline's chamber, silver tray in hand, inquiring if there was anything amiss. The Duchess assured her it was merely a headache. Restless sleep had left Rosaline frail. When asked about summoning a physician, she simply declined, leaning upon her hand. Soon, the butler made his entrance, discreetly clearing his throat to draw Rosaline's notice. The man relayed that Lady Elon asked for an audience and bore pressing news. Rosaline directed for her to be taken to the parlor. Sunbeams played through sapphire curtains, while white and gold walls emphasized the room's rich opulence. Attentive, the maid ushered the distinguished guest. Upon Rosaline's entrance to the drawing room, Lady Elon's focus finally fixed on her. Lady Elon, striking in a splendid noble gown, pronounced the Duchess, named cheerfully, conveying her delight at the reunion. With warmth, Lady Elon embraced the Duchess, her smile blooming. It had been ages since their last meeting, and Rosaline remarked on her radiant appearance. Soon it became apparent Lady Elon bore a present. She urged that it could not wait. Rosaline looked at her with questioning eyes. Servants escorted in a battered cage, its surface marred by what seemed enormous claws. Astonished, the Duchess commented on the extraordinary nature of the offering. Elon admitted to her own eager anticipation. Shadows concealed the interior beyond the bars. In a burst of enthusiasm, Elon declared that the moment she spotted it at the auction, the Duchess sprung to her mind. Not pausing to consider, she bid extravagantly, believing the inside to be of greater importance than the vessel. Rosaline felt a twinge of discomfort. Brimming with energy, Elon directed the staff to unfasten the cage, as a bewildered Rosaline looked on, awaiting events. The bolts securing the huge cage clanked apart, about to reveal whatever lingered in the opaque gloom. Smoothing her fabrics, Lady Elon stood tall, a self-satisfied grin playing on her lips, signaling the present was the finest she had received. Advancing gracefully, the noble woman leaned toward Rosaline, her voice low and questioning. "What do you think, Rosa?" Would ladies claim that such a gift was rare indeed? Rosaline stared, lost for words, at what the cage contained. Upon unlocking it, they revealed a creature in chains, a blindfold masking his eyes. My lady promised he'd become a true prize with the right nurturing. Perched atop his head were feline ears, blending perfectly with his tangle of brown hair. His tail stood out stridently against the tattered, ivory-hued garments draped over him. In that instant, the world seemed to freeze. Color drained from the Duchess's cheeks, her eyes stretched wide. Reeling, she muttered, "It's a slave." Inside the enclosure, a young beast eagle slouched miserably, the creature's body crisscrossed with wounds, its beak muffled. Milady recounted glimpsing him by happenstance at auction, remembering how the Duchess never kept such souls on her land. Thoughtfully, the noble confessed that, when trained, slaves could be quite practical, serving as admirable guardians. Unconvinced, Rosaline gestured toward the beast child, ground in her tone as she reminded that he was no more than a boy. Shielding her features with a fan, Milady explained that beast folk quicken into maturity, blossoming into adulthood within a couple of years. Elon leaned ever closer, breath close to the Duchess's ear, confiding that grown ones were unmanageable. As she explained, taming must begin early, or these individuals could never serve with loyalty as attendants. Fully matured servants chafed under supervision, refusing true fealty, giving devotion only to their kin. This is why the young ones were chosen. Resorting to mind-influencing potions was seen as the swiftest method for subjugation. Rosaline's earnest gaze flicked to the youth before her, studying each restraint, the band across his eyes and the gag silencing his voice. His wrists were cleverly fastened, and the lad had been transported inside a crate. The Duchess mused inwardly, questioning if the unfortunate beast understood his grim circumstances. Heaving a weary sigh, Rosaline pressed her palm to her brow, prepared to firmly refuse Lady Elon's offer. My lady, half listening and cutting in smoothly, mentioned that time had slipped by and their journey back to the estate was already undue. Elon made her way briskly towards the doorway, remarking with a smile that she wished they had time to converse, yet her schedule did not allow it. Rosaline, confusion coloring her words, called after Milady's retreating figure. With an enigmatic grin, Elon offered the Duchess a wish for fortune and alluded to a speedy discussion before vanishing, leaving only tantalizing suspicions behind. After Elon departed, the Grand Manor's wide ivory doors adorned with gilt shut behind her with a sonorous clang. A butler, steadfast in his devotion to Rosaline, silently appeared and inquired how he might proceed following those events, awaiting her command. Yet the young lady offered no reply. Lines creased her brow, and pinching the bridge of her nose, the Duchess mulled over whether the transaction of human lives remained sanctioned within the Empire's bounds. She ultimately resolved that anything permitted by the law must, by default, be considered acceptable. Rosaline collapsed upon the plush sofa in exhaustion, the burdensome reality heavy upon her thoughts. Out of nowhere, a maid addressed her. Noticing her mistress, the maid approached gingerly with a tea tray, yet an uncertainty made her pause mid-step. With a curt motion, the Duchess dismissed the offered cup, stating her preference at the moment was for wine. The maid hastened to attend to this sudden desire, while the observant butler quietly suggested that they might send the cage and its occupant away. Rosaline leaned her head back and let her eyes drift shut, consumed by silence for a span. After contemplating her response, Rosaline finally lifted her gaze to the butler and clarified that, should she return the boy, it would not be under these circumstances. The servant's eyes slid to the creature, yet confined, as he questioned what method they would employ regarding him instead. Diverting her stare, Rosaline commanded that the young one be bathed and given a proper bed, instructing that the crate be disposed of at once. Her gaze now sharp and resolute, she continued, "Furthermore, please summon Nora." Nora soon entered, gracefully setting down a fine porcelain teacup upon its saucer, her posture attentive and words poised. With respectful modesty, Nora met the Duchess's eyes and informed her that she'd addressed all essential matters. Opposite the Duchess sat Eleanor Greenwood, clad in delicate blue and strands like silver, her posture demure with fingers lightly entwined upon her knees. The beastkin youth lay upon fresh linens, tucked securely under a coverlet. Eleanor assured him that his injuries would mend in a few days, as those of enslaved folk often did. It was Nora who remarked that the countless wounds concentrated on the same areas had created the multitude of scars. Lost in thought, Rosaline offered nothing in response. Eleanor Greenwood, unusually erudite for a lady of rank, had devoted her efforts to medicine and alleviating the suffering of bondservants. The Duchess expressed gratitude for her attentiveness to the beastman's injuries. Rosaline acknowledged that treating such injuries without Nora would have been impossible, and questioned inwardly what sort of draft the boy might have been given, as still he remained asleep. She admitted her initial intent had been to return the youth to Elon, but hesitated as Nora raised her brows, seeming ready to object. Rosaline signaled for her to hear her out and explained her new resolve. For the boy, remaining a slave would only invite further misery. She confessed plans to grant him freedom when he recovered, intending to inform Elon he had simply escaped. Nora questioned this. "You mean to let him leave? Where would he go?" The Duchess answered calmly that the child did indeed have a destination. Without lifting her gaze, Nora uttered, "Perhaps such a place does not even exist." In that instant, the Duchess seemed struck by a thought she hadn't previously entertained. The boy might truly have no home to call his own. Should he have been captured and traded, going back would only mean falling into the hands of traffickers again. There was also the likelihood that he'd been born a captive, with no memory of a real homeland. Eleanor, troubled by the boy's fate, maintained that he truly had nowhere he could return. She further pointed out that as soon as the young man set foot on the streets, he'd be recaptured and end up sold once more. Just hearing this made Rosaline shudder uneasily. Staring mournfully at her reflection inside her cup, the young woman pondered what she ought to do next. She firmly believed she simply couldn't leave him at the estate. Fixing Rosaline with a cunning look, Eleanor inquired, "What prevents you?" "Only the fact that he is a prisoner." With her hand massaging her brow, the Duchess clarified her reasoning. The girl was too young to act as a surrogate for the boy's family. After all, he was not a little child, but a young man. She believed he'd suffer even more this way. Lady Nora, raising her hand, indicated that she comprehended what the Duchess implied. With assured words, the woman insisted the beastman was no child. Rosaline's expression was overcome by confusion. Pointing upward like a seasoned instructor, Eleanor explained that though he appeared childlike, the lad was no younger than 20. At this, the Duchess faced him, deeply amazed. Still dubious of Nora's claim, the girl examined him closely, exclaiming in disbelief, "20? This petite fellow?" Lady Greenwood assured Rosaline that, should the youth find a mate and come of age, he would look just as an ordinary man, safe from the threat of capture. Rosaline cut her short midway, halting her with an upraised hand to inquire, "Hold on, can he fully assume a human shape?" It was well known that captives, no matter the years they carried, bore animal-like ears and tails, alongside other distinguishing features. The noblewoman further mentioned that this didn't apply to every captive, but in the boy's case, such change was possible as he descended from the rare Quran tribe. The Quran tribe itself was scarcely seen, about which Lady Nora admitted ignorance. Adding to their rarity were the tribe's dark-skinned members. The lady mentioned, too, that many traders mistakenly chalked the dark skin up to a freakish deviation. With silvery moonbeams illuminating the night outside, Lady Eleanor sagely remarked that these rarities made poor trade. Should they cause any trouble, merchants incurred only losses. Rosaline, contemplating deeply, realized Elon deemed the youth extraordinary, and every time milady uncovered something unusual, her eyes glimmered with excitement. Irritation was etched across Eleanor's face. She believed Elon would go to great lengths for so rare a treasure, even if weighed down by misfortune. Accordingly, she claimed the youth should not be let go, for otherwise Rosaline's concern for him would remain. With a pensive and distant tone as her head bowed, the Duchess calmly stated that his welfare would not persistently trouble her. Unmoved by this unfeeling reply, Lady Greenwood grew inflamed with passion, crying out that, lacking any affection for the girl, she would have abandoned him without hesitation from their very first meeting. The girl listened coolly to the older woman's remonstrance, her hand to her hair. With emphasis, the woman added, "You instantly dispose of all that stands in your way, do you not? Isn't that correct, Rosalind Appledon?" The noble women stood in the knight's shelter by the stately carriage. Rosaline proposed putting Nora up for one more evening, but Nora declined, mentioning the hour and a patient scheduled for the following day. Eager to assist, Lady Nora reassured Rosaline that she would strive to find individuals able to offer the beastman protection. With significance etched on her features, Eleanor remarked she would gladly host him if only her home could accommodate one more. Rosaline folded her arms and asserted that Eleanor ought to have agreed to a new residence when it was proposed to her. Nora merely smiled warmly and suggested she ask her once more after half a year had passed. Quizzically, the Duchess asked, "Then you are willing to accept my offer?" With a careful adjustment of her elegant hat, Nora assured her that perhaps she would. Lady Greenwood gazed tenderly at Rosaline, a silent gesture of support, making it clear her loyalty would never waver. Just before departing, Nora requested to be notified upon the young man's awakening. The Duchess, her eyes shining with gratitude, gave her word. The withdrawal of Lady Nora's carriage was underscored by the rhythmic beating of pale horses' hooves. Meanwhile, a radiant, star-filled sky with a climbing moon bid adieu to the distinguished visitor by Rosaline's side. A quiet hush settled over the manor, broken only by the occasional murmur of the leaves. The cold, ascending moon drifted above, spilling her chill silver across the night. Opposite the ornate four-poster where the youth was sprawled, Rosaline kept vigil for him to stir. Gentle nocturnal beams filtered in, delicately brightening the room. The beastman lay supine, perspiration shining on his face, a clear sign of fever. It was evident Nora had expertly tended each wound. A caring, lively glance passed from Rosaline toward him as she lifted her hand in quiet anticipation. With tenderness, the girl smoothed her palm across his brow, struck by a silent apprehension. Rosaline's concern for the youth, plain on her face, sparked a recollection of her recent dialogue with Eleanor. Eleanor recounted that once, Qurans were numerous, but relentless hunting whittled them away. When Rosaline wondered why, she was told it stemmed from tales about gifts unique to Qurans. Lowering her gaze, Lady Nora quietly admitted those tales had been untrue. The Duchess, listening from behind, inquired what powers were allegedly in question. Eleanor, replying only with an affirmation, insisted she'd rather not name it, and that such knowledge wasn't necessary for the young girl. All that truly remained certain was the Quran clan had given their lives for empty hearsay. Rosaline listened to Nora, inwardly contemplative, wrapped in silence. Golden sunlight flowed down pale stone walls, while tall windows shimmered, catching vastness from the heavens. An unmistakable dawn had reached the estate. Rosalind, entering the youth's quarters, looked on in disbelief. She had been so sure he was too drained to move. Behind her, the butler stood quietly, his gaze lowered. Casting a glance around, the Duchess noticed furniture overturned and marred, floors and walls smeared, crockery shattered in disarray. One maid, who must have come to check on the young man earlier, sat tending a scratch on her arm, the Duchess's servant close by, clearly uneasy. There they discovered the beastman perched high atop a cupboard, eyes fixed downward onto the gathering below. The young man's glare seethed with fiery resentment towards the company. His wolfish grin betrayed a readiness to strike at a moment's notice. The moment Rosaline heard he was conscious, even before he'd eaten, she hurried straight over. She glanced at the butler and asked with curiosity, "It's just flying, so what's wrong?" The butler averted his gaze, explaining he had simply acted on Eleanor's instructions and served the boy some soup. As the butler neared, the beastman bared his teeth and didn't so much as glance at the bowl. Previously, Eleanor had suspected that the youth might have gone hungry for an agonizing span. After hearing this, Rosaline inquired, "Have you attempted to speak with him?" The butler met her question with a puzzled expression. The young woman continued, pointing out that the boy wasn't a toddler and likely capable of conversation. With a deep exhale, the butler confessed his uncertainty about the boy's ability to talk, his sigh making it clear he was unsure whether the boy could communicate. Once she'd heard him out, Rosaline bowed her head in helplessness, pressing her hand against her brow. Steeling herself, the girl bravely advanced toward the youth. Concern flickered in the maid's eyes while the young man waited tensely, ready for conflict and studying her every move. Approaching even closer, the Duchess set her arm resolutely at her side, quietly considering how to handle him. The youth offered her a smirk mixed with a growl, making clear his displeasure at her advance. Rosaline knit her brow, giving the beastman a direct order to descend the stairs. Instead, the lad responded by snarling with renewed vigor, those wild yellow eyes surveying her with a predator's focus. Despite everything, the Duchess regarded him serenely, though her guards behind her prepared to draw steel to shield their lady from any threat. Rosaline motioned with her hand for the uneasy guards to hold back, remarking that the single child had stirred up so much commotion since dawn. Assuring the protectors all was under control, the girl fixed the boy with a daunting stare, commanding his attention. Rosaline resolved to make him understand she wasn't inclined to offer repeated forgiveness. Still, considering his past woes, she wished to grant him another opportunity. The boy listened on, his grin unconcealed. The Duchess explained that the staff were not aiming to hurt, but to nourish him. She also assured him she had no intention of making him a servant. Even as the girl relayed how she'd summoned a physician for the boy, he continued to glare at her. Soothing her tone, Rosaline told him that were he to desire it, she could set him free. She clarified this offer came with the requirement that he first come down, and the youth, dropping the smirk, studied her with skeptical eyes. Her calm gaze unwavering, she added that he must also express his regret to all present. Following Rosaline's pronouncements, a tranquil stillness settled upon the grand, elegantly furnished room. The Duchess folded her arms with poise, and just behind her the butler made no effort to hide his sense of anticipation. Servants of the house held their silence, uncertain whether to act, remaining patiently alert for what would unfold next. The boy parted his lips, preparing to speak. Yet in response to Rosaline's ultimatum, the child simply replied with a yawn, making no attempt to disguise his weariness. Speechless at such bluntness before their mistress, the guards stared, mouths agape. Refusing to come down from the cabinet, the beastman shifted around, seeking a more agreeable position. In the following instant, he turned away from everyone, curling onto his side as though ready for sleep. The others observed him in a thoughtful hush. Confronted with this display of blatant discourtesy, the mansion's inhabitants found themselves in utter disbelief. The two maids were simultaneously startled, unanimously struck by how disgraceful they found his behavior. Rosaline gazed at him wordlessly, her lips parted in surprise. Moments later, the Duchess spoke to the staff in an organized fashion, instructing them to tidy up and keep to their regular cleaning duties. The butler lifted his eyebrows in mute inquiry. Rosaline's gaze sharpened and her forehead knitted in displeasure. With a raised finger pointing toward the lad, she declared, "And in addition, he is to receive neither food nor drink." The butler sought clarification on how long this measure should last, to which Rosaline, after the smallest pause, replied, "You'd like to know for how long." Rosaline faced the butler fiercely, gesturing at the animal keeper perched atop the cabinet, and proclaimed, "Until he requests it himself." The boy's displeasure was apparent in the restless twitch of his tail. The Duchess, with commanding voice, reiterated that he was not, under any situation, to be given nourishment. The attendants behind her seemed uneasy, and the astonished butler acceded, quietly lamenting the childishness of it all. A fresh dawn brightened Lady Appleton's estate. The morning light and serene wind were pleasantly bracing. Yesterday's happenings had sown the seeds of new chapters, a modest battle rising between the maiden and the young beast. Since sunrise, Rosaline had been rubbing her brow in weary contemplation. She wondered if the boy's resilience was stubbornness or something else as well. Yet again, the young man's room was a tangle of overturned furnishings, chaos reigning in every corner. Worried by the boy's intense outburst, the maid lifted the shattered chair to show her lady, informing her that once more, the youngster had destroyed everything. This time he'd turned his destructive attention upon the lavish drapes, specially imported at great cost. Rosaline elegantly lifted her slender arm, underscoring the disaster of the scene. She could not fathom where he found the strength for such regular havoc. The gilded glow of evening swept through the grand corridor. Ceiling-high chandeliers shimmered above, and lofty scarlet curtains framed the crystal-paned windows. Rosaline proceeded along the passageway, her measured steps betraying annoyance from the prior day's drama. Her mind dwelled on the certainty that the boy would not remain welcome in the house. Suddenly, something peculiar drew Rosaline's curiosity. She turned her head, intrigued. Resting on the corridor floor, she noticed streaks of crimson resembling blood. Rosaline recalled the maid's earlier words. The youth had smashed a flower pot and perhaps trod upon its shards, requiring attention, though he refused to let help approach him. The maiden resolved to follow the small trail of blood, no doubt left behind by the wild youth. Rosaline's figure paused at a splendid gilded window. She lingered there, observing an unusual detail. The Duchess retrieved a broken fragment. Earlier, the butler had reported the boy had shattered it. Pondering, she remembered the manor's windows, fashioned from the finest crystal and immune even to spells, let alone a prisoner's touch. Rosaline found herself mystified, for there was no need to break the window. He could have simply opened it if he wished to run away. Surely, in causing such distress for those in the house, the youth must have drained himself considerably. One of the maids, troubled by concern for the youth, secretly delivered meals to him, though he consistently discarded them as always, merely creating more chores for the household. Never once did he request any nourishment for himself. The Duchess allowed herself to ponder whether she ought to have punished the maid for disregarding her lady's injunctions. Rosaline's focus was drawn to a depiction of that very maid, standing alongside the manor's cook, her countenance all smiles, as she prepared to accept a silver platter laden with food. Her eyes grew gentler. Rosaline observed as the cook and maid shared a conversation. The maid expressed gratitude, saying the boy would enjoy it greatly since it was made by him. The Duchess finally chose to let the matter pass. A maid summoned Rosaline. Bowing deeply before her mistress, she exclaimed that the child could not be found. Her features were fixed in excitement. The maid came across Rosaline in the midst of reading. Upon hearing the update, Rosaline paused, fingers resting on a page, and regarded the maid silently. An uneasy quiet filled the room. Rosaline felt certain the lad must be hiding somewhere out of stubborn hunger, and would emerge sooner or later. Yet his continued absence revealed to her that she'd misjudged. Not a drop had passed the young man's lips in 4 days. The Duchess reflected that, no matter how resilient one's spirit, the body would inevitably suffer. He might easily succumb to illness. It also struck Rosaline that despite only 4 days spent within the mansion's walls, his state had rapidly deteriorated. Unable to return to her book in the wake of such distressing news, the Duchess anxiously massaged her brow. Leaning her head on one palm, the girl seemed as though the weight of contemplation might soon bloom into a headache. She wished only to act as though everything was as it always had been. Rosaline winced at the thought that, if Nora were to overhear her inner doubts, rage would surely follow. And yet, she had offered the beastman freedom of choice from the outset. The Duchess reflected that she could not assume responsibility for someone habituated to independence in his actions. Suddenly, a worried maid called out her name, breaking her reverie, the very servant who delivered meals to the boy. Rosaline perceived the concern in the girl's look and, anticipating the unspoken plea, instructed her to search the mansion for the lost youth. The maid, with gracious obedience, nodded assent. Thus, every servant began to comb through the mansion, revisiting countless chambers again and again. Rooms, the laundry, and even the bathing quarters were all inspected. As the evening glow slipped into Rosaline's chamber, their diligent search persisted until darkness fell. Yet ultimately, their efforts proved in vain. Sunset gently embraced the vast grounds. Blossoms curled their petals, readying themselves for night to descend. Upon the twisting staircase, Rosaline rested her hand upon the railing while the attendants below captured her attention. Two maidservants, including the one charged with caring for the boy, and a man had gathered at the estate's main threshold. The man set to unbolt the grand doors. One maid gripped a glowing lantern in her slender fingers. It was clear that the three intended to extend their search outside for the missing boy. Rosaline called out after them in warning, insisting that, should the youth have strayed to the gardens, the onset of night would render him difficult to find. To this, the lamp-bearer answered with a warm and heartfelt smile that they could not abandon him. Rosaline cast a fleeting, encouraging glance their way, as if silently wishing success for their search. The world outside was awash in peach and tangerine. Clouds weightlessly scattered. Breezes whispered through the fallen leaves beneath verdant trees. The Duchess lowered her eyes in consternation. Worry quickened her mind. Had he, in truth, run away and collapsed? Overwhelmed by memories, Rosaline entertained the improbable hope that maybe there would be no need to rid themselves of the body. The Duchess fretted, suspecting she had been harsher than necessary toward the youth. As she replayed the boy's posture, his features and charming smile in her thoughts, Rosaline found herself second-guessing her actions. Perhaps she never should have taken Nora's advice and allowed him to escape. Heavily burdened by her reflections, the young woman reasoned that by releasing the boy, she might grant mercy to both him and herself. Poised in the opulent hallway aglow with shimmering gold, Rosaline lingered in pensive absorption. A moment later, revelation bloomed within her, and inwardly she declared, "Can it truly be?" The Duchess swept rapidly over the lush carpet, so eagerly she was almost dashing. Startled by his flustered mistress, the butler called her name in puzzlement, but she sailed by, ignoring his presence entirely. Intent on his query about her urgent destination, the girl silenced him with the thunderous echo of the grand, gilded door slamming shut. The butler was left grappling with a storm of new questions. He remained where he was, his face a mask of bewilderment. The mellow light of dusk draped itself over blossoming trees within the manor's gardens. Slender beams danced brightly over the silent neighborhood. Pulse racing, Rosaline bolted into the open, where amidst the flowering grounds, servants hunted fervently for the vanished lad. With palms cupped beside her lips, a maid shouted, "Dear, where have you gone?" The Duchess halted, observing the youthful maids so intent on their search. Her gaze softened, radiating warmth and empathy. Then she strode onward. The heavens above grew tinged with crimson as the sun dipped, lending a genial orange brilliance to the greenery of the woods. Rosaline pressed straight along on her course, following a path marked by weary footsteps. She moved deftly past rustling leaves and interwoven branches, her eyes fixed as she forged ahead. A lovely, alabaster pavilion emerged before her, positioned by the rim of a gentle pond. The sanctuary nestled there was empty. She mused that were his motives truly to escape, he likely would not linger at all. Intent on her mission, the Duchess earnestly scanned her surroundings in the hopes of finding any hint of the young man. Upon catching sight of something afar, her eyes started with sudden clarity. Not pausing even a breath, she dashed ahead, eager to determine if what she saw was indeed the beastman boy. Upon approaching, Rosaline came upon a boy sprawled beneath an ancient bare-branched tree. The beastman remained unresponsive, perspiration purling on his skin, hints of a fever evident. Within her heart, Rosaline consoled herself, "I suspected as much." Almost involuntarily, she lowered herself by his side. Gently helping him upright, she anxiously tried to read the state of his health. Worry clouded Rosaline's vision as she hovered her hand over his lips and watched for the rise and fall of his breath, her spirit stricken with dread. The young woman softly raised her hand to his cheek, searching for signs of breath in the stirring air. Rosaline exhaled, a sense of relief washing over her. Her instincts were correct. The young man was still alive, albeit gravely weak. The Duchess observed that she had found the youth by the water's edge. She surmised he must have been parched, which had drawn him here. The young man remained secluded in his chamber throughout the day, shunning any visitors. All that lay before his window was the vast, tranquil park. Overcome with thirst, the boy shattered a window, fleeing outside in quest of something to drink. His search led him deep within the heart of the woods. Faced with the circumstances, Rosaline felt an odd blend of irritation and anticipation. Mentally, she chastised him for rejecting the maid's offer of water instead of acting sensibly. Tenderly cradling the young man, she made sure he wouldn't lapse onto the chilly, unwelcoming earth. The dire state he was in struck her, and she pondered as to why he had avoided those who wished to care for him. It occurred to the Duchess that perhaps he refused to listen to others, or that, when truly vulnerable, the poor soul simply could not entrust himself to them. Her mission had been to instruct him, but the gaunt zoo worker may have developed habits necessary for survival after enduring trauma, beyond which social niceties held little meaning. Almost as though she shouldered the blame, Rosaline came to realize she'd been overbearing. Criticizing herself inwardly, she reflected, "Strict discipline is justifiable only when life itself isn't at stake." The Duchess gently rose, embracing the boy against her. Swathing him in her own attire, she offered a look of warmth and understanding. As Rosaline bore the young man in her embrace, she couldn't escape the sense of how frail he was. She regarded him anxiously and, with a certain compassion, mused to herself, "Far too slight." Passing by the lake, where the sunlight scattered over the water, their reflections flickered together. In a hushed tone, the Duchess murmured to him, declaring she was not one who easily gave second chances. Yet, her intention was to grant not the second, but a third chance, a rarity in itself. With steady gait, she carried him back towards the grand estate. When night descended and the moon poured drowsy light through the window's glass, shadows slow danced on ornamental drapes. Only by the following evening did the beastkin she had rescued stir from his slumber. That same night, the Duchess lingered in her chamber at a broad desk, propping her head upon her hand as she awaited the supper bell. Deep in contemplation, Rosaline gazed into the distance, fingertips gently resting against her lips. Her attention rested on the young man, who, with the familiarity of practice, sat stoically atop the wardrobe, observing the Duchess from his vantage point. Taking in the scene, Rosaline exclaimed quizzically, "Once again?" Unmoved, the beastkin watched her in silence, his hands braced on his knees. His sharp, amber eyes fixated on her, their gaze keen. Yet, in this moment, he carried a calmer demeanor than before. Lady Apelden kept her focus on him, a slight irritation visible in her frown, muttering, "It would seem he finds the wardrobe to his liking." Just then, the chamber's door swung open, heralding the forthcoming meal. A maid entered and hailed Rosaline, announcing her arrival with food. The young beastkin perked up, clearly intrigued by her words. She steered a serving cart bearing a tempting array of treats. The expansive table had been lovingly arranged, overflowing with an array of delicious, tempting foods. Perched atop the cabinet, the young man, likely quite ravenous, kept his gaze fixed firmly on the abundant meal. Although he showed no immediate desire to join the feast, his longing look and the persistent growl in his belly spoke for him. A maid fussed attentively over her chores, setting out dishes for her mistress, while Rosaline observed the quiet proceedings. Patiently waiting until the spread was finally prepared, Rosaline lazily directed her gaze to the beastman, beckoning him to step down and dine. The small creature lingered where he was, only giving a flick of his tail as an answer. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Turning away to reveal her vexation, the girl displayed clear annoyance. Rosaline was skeptical he would join her, so she declared with mock sternness that she would eat everything herself if he refused. Yet the pangs of hunger bested the boy's reservations, and soon he sprang nimbly down from his perch. For a moment, Rosaline felt genuine surprise. At last, he was heedful of her words. Rising up from nearly crouching, the young beastman moved towards the banquet and quickly polished off a morsel of savory beef. Rosaline, who doubted he would even taste it, looked on in disbelief. The maid, stationed behind the Duchess, straightened up with happiness at seeing their guest finally partake of a meal. Observing the young man's hearty appetite, the maid recalled how Rosaline had kept vigil all night beside him, devotedly tending to his needs, and wondered if he carried any memory of it. Content, the beastman seemed to savor every bite as he licked his plate, as the Duchess's thoughts returned to when she had fed him broth throughout the night in hopes of avoiding any unforeseen trouble. It occurred to Rosaline that perhaps he consumed his food purely as a survival instinct, yet upon seeing him eat unafraid, she thought perhaps he truly remembered that someone had cared for him. Rosaline's lips curled into a serene smile as she watched the youth heartily enjoy her homemade meal. Then, quite suddenly, the boy leapt atop the table with his plate in tow, much like a mischievous kitten. The Duchess knocked an admonition, her firm voice warning that one eats properly, seated in a chair. Unprepared for such remonstration, the beastman scurried deftly away from the table. Wasting no time, he darted beneath the bedding, curling out of sight. The girl called after him, insisting she was not finished yet. His antics left the Duchess with an expression of wide-eyed astonishment and disbelief. Resigning herself to the odd circumstances, the girl sank heavily back into her chair. With her chin resting drearily on her hand, Rosaline mused to herself. It's a relief he's finally eating, though there's quite a bit he must still master. Snuggled up, the young man observed her keenly, hidden beneath the cover as he peeked out at her. A little exasperated, Rosaline inwardly bewailed the peculiarity of it all. How here she was, sharing her bed not with a husband, but with a child whose very name she didn't even know. Then, unexpectedly, her curiosity was met with a softly spoken answer. Luke. The girl's eyes instantly flickered over to the young man stretched upon the bed, who meanwhile fixed her with an intense stare, his head propped up on one arm. Once she realized those fragments of speech had come from him, Rosaline was taken aback. She hadn't expected the beastman was capable of conversation. The youth cast a glance at his own palm, displaying all 5 fingers. By that, he meant that there existed 5 individuals like Luke. Perplexed, the Duchess struggled to comprehend his meaning. She supposed he referred to some numerical system for identifying the faceless slaves, where such names described not people, but rather belongings. The young man had never received another name and couldn't recall his parents, for he had been taken as an infant. No living being cared enough to wonder about his real name. Rosaline was unique, the first to show any curiosity about his identity, and so he told her. To her, these so-called names seemed unusual. People do not typically have numbers as part of their names, she pointed out. The young man's expression darkened, Quietly, he remarked that he did not even possess enough humanity to warrant a true name, as she was familiar with. Rosaline sat frozen, a cloud of quiet shock passing over her until she became motionless and wordless for a stretch. Deeply contemplative, the Duchess pondered at length what title might properly befit the youth. After her thoughts traveled for some minutes, she locked gazes with him and christened him Fenlir, her tone resolute. Rosaline gently assured him that from that moment he would belong among people, and if the name did not suit him, he had every right to select another. Remaining immersed in inner musings and unwarned by words, the young man simply sat, lost in contemplation. Lightly nudging his leg with her foot, Rosaline's curiosity was piqued, and she voiced her wonder as to why he'd chosen to share his name with her. Confidence plain in his voice, he told her it was in exchange for being given a bed to sleep in. At this, Rosaline's brows drew together, and she was left puzzling over what she'd previously said about her husband and the bed. The girl countered lightly. Her bed was worth a significant sum to have crafted, so by that standard, his name must be rather precious indeed. To this, the young man averted his eyes and offered no response. He gave his ear a thoughtful scratch, and, with notable gravity, pronounced that names were far from the chief concern. His real victory was in speaking at all. With a slight narrowing of her brows, she clocked his remark as a form of accolade, directed now at her. Rosaline responded then with an over-polished appreciation, thick with irony. Fenlir, hands cradled around his cheeks, fixed Rosaline with a keen, knowing look. "Words are the one gift you'll never strip from me," he declared. "No one until now has ever drawn speech out of me." Rosaline lingered in silence. Wordless she sat for several moments, though inside a swell of amazement tumbled on even as her countenance remained composed. Gradually her brows rose, and she questioned if he truly hadn't spoken to anyone else ever before. Fenlir gave his answer quickly enough, certainty in his voice as he shook his head with a negative gesture. The young man shared that he had been taken in his earliest days, an infant seized and silenced. Eleanor persisted, insisting rather firmly that he must be about 20 years of age. He likely wound up being auctioned off because no one wished to purchase him, or, soon after a brief ownership, he was simply returned. Fenlir would not speak with anyone. His quiet resistance, refusing both speech to a master and attention, kept him endlessly being shuffled about like some disregarded article. Drawing in a slow breath, Rosaline cast her gaze downward. She chose to remain silent, opting not to probe Fenlir about his history. Eager to steer the conversation elsewhere, the Duchess suddenly stood up from her seat. She struck the table with such force that the dishes trembled, commanding the young man never to climb atop it again, lest he find himself with nothing but water instead of soup. She further declared that the bed where the young man had so languidly rested actually belonged to her. His use of it had been allowed merely because he was ill. Now, Rosaline demanded that Fenlir relocate to another room. All the young man's movements signaled an outright refusal to depart. Bundled beneath the blanket like a mule unwilling to budge, only two resentful eyes glinting from the folds, he eyed Rosaline fleetingly. As the girl laid down her rules, Fenlir simply flipped with a deft little hop onto his side, turning defiantly away from Rosaline. Confronted with such boldness, the Duchess's eyes grew wide with shock as she thought to herself, "How aggravating!" An array of unpleasant feelings surged within the girl. She had suspected as much would happen, yet a stubborn streak still whispered to simply haul him off. Choosing differently, she softened, letting compassion quiet her irritation. After all, she remembered he had only recently awakened, so she permitted him to sleep beside her once more. Wearily, the girl settled next to Fenlir, smoothing her golden hair, thinking that to scold him now would only sap the last of her strength. Rosaline found a resting spot on her bed, and for some time let her eyes drift across the ceiling. Looking at Fenlir resting nearby, she quietly considered whether sleep had already claimed him. For Fenlir, the past few days had brought little comfort. Enveloped by the plush, costly mattress, he surrendered to slumber, finally able to rejuvenate. Rosaline directed a gentle glance toward the young man, ruminating that it had been an age since she'd shared the nocturnal hush of her bed with another's breathing so close. With a wistful glimmer in her eyes, she recalled Nora mentioning he had seen 20 years. Still, she brushed the thought aside, knowing it would serve no purpose to dwell on it now. The name Fenlir signified a fresh journey for the young man. A majority among the staff welcomed him as one of their own, yet there remained a few who eyed the manor's new dweller with skepticism. Being a captive, Fenlir became the subject of cold stares and silent judgments from certain inhabitants of the household. As a beastman, he acutely sensed even the subtlest hints of animosity. Even with words left unsaid, he intuited it all, and it weighed his spirits down. Rosaline turned toward him, intent on discovering what spurred his flight. Fenlir was perched, as usual, atop the stately, opulent wardrobe, his fearful gaze locked upon the girl. His exasperation transparent, Fenlir let it show that her behavior struck him as peculiar. The Duchess, troubled, gestured to an elegant pair of leather boots, inquiring why donning shoes should seem odd, since the real oddity was their absence. Fenlir answered simply, he'd never worn them before. With a flash of impatience, Rosaline placed a hand on her hip and informed the young man that his old ways were wrong. It was time to start using shoes. Going barefoot would make his feet filthy, not to mention the potential hazards. Fenlir, still obstinately disputing, retorted with a twist of irony that his feet were perfectly clean. Rosaline, not breaking composure, said with chilling composure, "Obviously so, since you just took a dip. Who knows what mischief you got up to in there?" With a teacher's air, Rosaline put her finger in the air, instructing Fenlir that the instant he went unshod, dirt would claim his feet. Fenlir, brow furrowed, announced that such things didn't bother him in the least. Resolute, the girl maintained her stance, still clutching the boots. The young man at length agreed to descend and approach Rosaline. The Duchess firmly requested the young man to try on the shoes. Fenlir stared at them with eyes filled by a wild blend of dread and bewilderment. Crossing her arms across her torso, the girl inquired what troubled Fenlir so greatly. His expression grew so mournful it affected even his ears, which drooped in shared sorrow. In a soft, faraway voice, Fenlir shared that slaves were forbidden to wear shoes. Rosaline looked at him with profound empathy, as if she saw beyond his appearance to his spirit carrying invisible burdens in need of solace. Bending down on one knee, the girl's features were brightened by the gentlest smile as she reassured him he was not a slave, and declared her answer was simply to destroy his old documents in flames. Fenlir, still at a loss, wondered aloud at her reasons, to which Rosaline answered calmly that she had no use for them. Hearing her reply, Fenlir's wide eyes lifted toward her in disbelief, like reflective surfaces showing only his astonishment at her words. Remaining kneeling before him, the girl's hands extended toward his sturdy boots, every movement intentional yet a mystery to Fenlir. Fenlir's attention was caught by Rosaline's actions, and hesitantly he questioned, "What is it that you're doing?" Rosaline softly cradled his foot, and with her free hand she adjusted his leather boot. Fenlir's hands tightened, anxiety written in every motion. Once Rosaline had the boots on him, she met his gaze and asked him politely to stand upright. Bewildered, Fenlir found himself facing her, leather boots now visible on his legs. His fingers gripped the hem of his shirt in unease, while Rosaline encouraged him to take a few steps. Fenlir obeyed with a couple of tentative steps, all while Rosaline's watchful eyes followed him closely. Rosaline, in the role of a solicitous elder sister, inquired sweetly if he was in pain. He responded honestly that they were a bit too tight for comfort. Her gaze settled downward. Rosaline softly stated that with time these things grew familiar, tranquility resting gently across her features. The young man's serious composure was unbroken as he regarded her in silence, until she added, voice warm, that the important part was, they caused him no real harm. Fenrir leaned subtly in her direction and declared, with a slight edge to his tone, that wearing them was not a necessity for him. With utmost gentleness, Rosaline reached out and took his hand, her touch feather-light, conveying to him that if he wished to remain, he must adapt and wear shoes. Faint surprise danced over Fenrir's features, while a flicker of uncertainty reflected in his amber eyes. Mulling over Rosaline's condition, his brows knitted thoughtfully. His eyes became more focused, and his lips shifted downward, hinting at his exasperation. Eventually, he exhaled lightly and acquiesced to Rosaline's terms. Billowing white clouds adorned the cerulean expanse. The Duchess's estate, ringed by lovely gardens, shimmered beneath streaming sunlight. Rosaline and Fenrir were secluded in her private chambers. Seated at the table, she was immersed in a red, gold-trimmed volume, eyes intent as she read its pages. The young man gazed outdoors, his tail wrapped wistfully around him. Gone were his disruptions, his attempts at escape, and former displays of resistance. Rosaline had quickly welcomed the manor's peace, but her hours shared with Fenrir became especially dear. Over the days of his stay, her fondness toward him had quietly deepened. A number of the household's staff continued to hold Fenrir at arm's length, thinking him far too clever, too astute a judge of companionship. Yet even the Duchess herself could not discern his true thoughts. Fenrir spent endless hours simply staring out the window, manor idle and dwelling in silence. Observing the evident interest with which Fenrir gazed beyond the window, Rosaline gently remarked that he was free to step outside if he wished. A glimmer of anticipation shone in his broad, golden eyes, mingled with bashful hesitancy, as though he feared he might be hoping in vain. Seeking reassurance, the youth asked, "Really, may I?" Without lifting her gaze from her book, Rosaline replied evenly, explaining he might misunderstood. He was not a prisoner here, merely a resident, and could go wherever he pleased. Fenrir, in silent answer to the Duchess' remark, quietly returned his attention to the window. Lost in thought, Rosaline's luminous eyes shone beneath a cascade of golden hair, her visage momentarily touched by a shadow of wistfulness. Remaining at the table, she slid a glance toward Fenrir, caught up in the sense that this scene had unfolded once before. Typically, the boy would follow Rosaline's instructions, yet when presented with alternatives, confusion would twist his features, causing him at last to simply refrain from acting. Now, after time had passed, even when Rosaline offered him a choice, Fenrir decided once more to stay put on the plush poof and let himself do nothing at all. With serene composure, the Duchess stood up from her chair and called to the young man. Grasping the hefty doorknob, she turned to Fenrir and suggested showing him around the manor. Fenrir directed a look full of innocent curiosity and quiet inquiry in her direction. A bright stream wound languidly through spindly, abundant trees, catching glints of sunlight along its way. Fenrir, enraptured, bounded eagerly through the woods, delighting in the wild, while Rosaline wandered behind at a tranquil pace. The Duchess considered warning him to be cautious, lest he trip, yet scarcely had she spoken, when the boy had already dived into the tall grass, attracted by something new. Clearly displeased, Fenrir responded in annoyance. "Do you think I'm simply a little child?" Overflowing affection swelled within Rosaline, making her long to greet Fenrir with a smile. Disguised as ordinary strolls, the Duchess began regularly bringing Fenrir along, as though his company brought a gentle brightness and vitality to the world around her. At the outset, Fenrir seemed at a loss, unsure how to behave, but before long he began to react ardently to all that stirred his interest. Although the manor's chambers left him unaffected, the greenhouse and gardens intrigued Fenrir. They were vivid realms brimming with warmth and delicate sounds. Fenrir reached out for the sturdy, sprawling trees, choosing them over the frailness of small blossoms. Woods and meadows danced before him more alluringly than solitary blooms. There, among the lively whispering wilds, he felt his spirit grow lighter. The Duchess realized she lacked even basic knowledge of the Cremons. It crossed her mind that perhaps they naturally dwelt in forests, united in formidable packs. One could not call Fenrir lazy. Rather, he seemed suspended in hesitation, unsure of the boundaries, unaware which actions were acceptable and which might offend. Each evening, Rosaline and Fenrir would meet as usual in her chamber, seated by a table dressed in a festively patterned cloth. A novel absorbed the Duchess as the boy quietly observed her. Carrying a delicate white teacup to her lips, the Duchess wore a reflective expression, her graceful hand curved tenderly around the pristine porcelain. Fenrir's intense stare lingered on Rosaline, his eyes brimming with fascination toward her. Noticing the young man's steady and firm focus upon her, Rosaline met it with a quizzical look. Fenrir responded only with a subtle shake of his head, wonder flickering in his features. Receiving no concrete explanation from Fenrir, the girl simply resumed attending to her own affairs. The youth's gaze still trailed after her, quietly revealing his keen intrigue. Fenrir admired her delicate eyes, upon which a graceful strand of golden hair rested. I observed with keen intent as her graceful fingers unhurriedly flipped through the book's pages. To Fenrir, Rosaline seemed the very soul of sophistication, reclining in comfort in her chair as she immersed herself in her reading. His lowered eyes periodically seeking her, the young man admitted to himself that Rosaline's presence dazzled him. As morning's gentle glow breached the lingering mist, the grand estate slowly stirred to life, basking under cloudless, promising skies. A snarl, tense with aggression, erupted from Fenrir and reverberated across the manor's chamber. The servants looked upon him in silent dread, shocked. Eleanor entered and attempted to soothe the boy, but he stubbornly resisted, registering his dissatisfaction with her guest. With careful deliberation, Nora assured Fenrir she merely wished to check on his well-being and posed no threat whatsoever. Anger twisted the young man's features. His amber gaze flashed warnings, teeth clenched, his furrowed brow announcing deep vexation. Rosaline pressed her hand tiredly against her brow, eyes closed, her countenance softened with exhaustion. She mused hazily. Another conflict is erupting. Seized by realization, Nora reflected upon the unexpected delay in the boy's healing, never having imagined a recovery spanning a whole week. A troubled crease formed on the Duchess's forehead as she recalled the turmoil Fenrir had unleashed during this time. Just as she was about to tell Nora, she hesitated. Careful and calm, Eleanor moved nearer to Fenrir and insisted that treatment was necessary. Suddenly, Fenrir darted with electrifying speed at Eleanor, showing his sharp claws. Irritated beyond measure, Rosaline called out his name in a burst, bearing her frustration for all to see. The young man crashed heavily to the floor, averted his glance, and with stormy defiance in his words, declared his mistrust toward the medical professionals. Almost instinctively, Fenrir mounted the wardrobe in a sudden act of desperation, seeking seclusion as he had time and again before. Rosaline sent Nora a look filled with silent inquiry, worried for her friend. Eleanor lifted her hand in reassurance, signaling she was unhurt. Abruptly turning toward Fenrir, she stubbornly reminded him, even amid the heightened tension, that Nora was, in truth, his savior. Not waiting for any retort, Rosaline sharply commanded him to descend at once. From the shadow of his shelter, Fenrir nevertheless peeked out, casting a watchful and distrustful gaze. After heeding the Duchess's summons, Fenrir leapt down and then moved to the bed in precise, calculated motion. Nora stood in astonishment as Rosaline, vexed by Fenrir's behavior, threatened to clear the room of every piece of furniture, but the youth merely replied that scaling the walls would not trouble him in the slightest. She interjected dryly, her tone laced with irony, questioning whether they were companions. Rosaline, matching the earlier exasperation, quickly denied any such association. Rosaline, a shade uncertain, wondered aloud if the young man required a medical assessment, since he seemed the picture of health within the estate's walls. Fenrir, stretched across the mattress awaiting a check, echoed her words with a smirk, dismissing all physicians as frauds. In reply, Eleanor reached for the young man's hand, pushing back her sleeve. Gently she inquired his name, assuring him that she posed no deception. Detached from any interest in Nora, the young man responded, "Fenlir." At this, the lady's features displayed genuine surprise. Eleanor directed a pondering look at Rosaline, silently questioning if she had bestowed that moniker upon him. Fenlir had once been the beloved cat belonging to Rosaline. Crossing her arms, Rosaline nonchalantly explained that no other name had been given, and, she added, it was not unusual. Recalling a promise she'd previously made, Nora mentioned that she had found suitable lodgings for Fenlir's use. Rosaline was thrown off guard, realizing that the matter had completely slipped her mind, her face showing fraught worry as her brows drew together. Eleanor's revelation stunned the young man, who stared at her intently. With calm persistence, Lady Greenwood conveyed that a certain Maureen would take him, if only he gave his consent. Rosaline, burdened by apparent regret, could not meet Fenlir's searing gaze. So fiercely attached to the youth was the girl, even as she'd planned not to remain with Fenlir, that it had fallen to Nora to make her promise to secure shelter for him. Taken aback, Fenlir's features contorted in disbelief, betrayed and cast aside by the very person he had chosen to believe in. Turning her face away, Rosaline quietly accepted that it was time for Fenlir to seek a path of his own, though releasing him was more painful than she cared to admit. For his sake, however, it was right. Bathed in the sharp light pouring through the gilded windows, Rosaline assured Nora she would compensate Morin fully for Fenlir's stay, no matter the expense. Upon hearing this, Nora's lips twisted into a pleased grin. She quipped that, had she known, she might have delivered more house servants to Morin, given the Duchess's readiness to offer generous payment. Lady Nora gave her final evaluation of Fenlir's well-being, noting his health as excellent and affirming that he was more than capable of moving to his prospective home. Fenlir simply flashed his teeth in a challenging smile, a growl rumbling out from deep within. With gentle censure, the Duchess told the young man he ought to express gratitude to Eleanor for her care. Clutching at the fabric, bristling with resentment, Fenlir grumbled his displeasure. "I didn't ask for this." Rosaline could not restrain herself and called out his name, her voice swelling to a near shout. Unable to contain his tumult of feelings sparked by all that had transpired, Fenlir pronounced with vehemence that nowhere had he asked for rescue nor for healing, nor declared a wish to journey to an orphanage, or even visit this grand manor. Caught off guard by these unveiled emotions, Nora remained silent, offering not a single remark. With the intensity of his speech somewhat diminished, but lacking all hope, Fenlir declared he didn't desire a thing. Rosaline gazed at him in silence, her eyes brimming with astonishment, while Fenlir cautioned the girl not to deceive herself into believing all was done solely for him. Awash with overpowering sentiment, the youth cried out that everyone only cared for themselves, then promptly leaped out through the balcony. The Duchess called after him, desperately attempting to halt his departure. In a blink of light, Fenlir's shape had vanished from the view, leaving behind the stark scene of balcony doors ajar. Astonished, Eleanor stood motionless, while Rosaline wearily covered her face with her hand in resignation. Nora contemplated whether she should go after him, prompting Rosaline to respond curtly that Fenlir ought to return himself, as she was hardly responsible for him. With her arms cradling her head, the girl foreshadowed an oncoming headache. Rosaline longed for repose sooner rather than later. The Duchess offered to guide Nora to the exit, explaining that there were other patients needing her care, which Nora accepted graciously, clutching her work satchel. Rosaline observed as the carriage rolled away, escorted by a pair of maids. A gentle wind rustled outside, as if it wished to ease the gloom of recent events. Peace fell upon the estate once again, and the daylight played along the corridor, accentuating its loveliness. The young lady's rooms grew distinctly emptier, returning her to solitude once more. Fatigued from everything the day had brought, Rosaline fixed her eyes on the ceiling, her mind adrift. Facing the window, her brows twitched under the heaviness of troublesome musings. The Duchess turned her gaze to that familiar spot where Fenrir loved to view the estate's expanse, pondering how long he had been present in her home. Rosaline's thoughts conjured the usual sight of the young man, sitting beside the window, absorbed in the beauty of the garden outside. The strange vacancy of the pale seat, coupled with the sudden stillness Fenrir's absence brought, these pressed down on the girl's spirit. That evening crept in with its indigo hues, as fallen tree leaves gently drifted on lazy breezes. Following the woodland trail, Rosaline walked with purpose, fully aware of where Fenrir could be found. Her journey ended by the broad old tree, where she'd once discovered the young man unconscious. A touch of annoyance showing on her features, she lifted her gaze and remarked, "Do you keep running off just so I'm forced to chase after you every time? You really are up high this time." Atop a once lush tree now stripped of leaves, Fenrir was perched at the very summit while Rosaline faced him directly. Since the young man didn't reply, the Duchess folded her arms and waited beneath the tree, puzzling briefly over his silence. Fenrir, unwilling to look at her, called back that he had concealed himself so she wouldn't have to find him and she should go away. Rosaline's gaze was unwavering, her golden curls surrounding a composed and earnest visage. Maintaining her poise with a note of unconcern, the girl stated that had Fenrir truly wished not to be found, he ought to have run away from the estate's bounds. With his head bent in dejection, Fenrir muttered that if she wanted him that far gone, then perhaps she shouldn't have bothered saving him. Guessing that the young man's response aimed to prove his maturity, Rosalind curiously inquired about his age. Fenrir, with a detached air, disclosed that he was uncertain, for he had tried to keep count. Rosaline felt bewildered that he was unaware of how old he was. Relaxing atop the branches, Fenrir mentioned that infants couldn't know their age. Still, estimated with some reflection that he was around 22. Rosalind asked upon which criteria he based this calculation. The young man explained that some 15 years earlier, he'd seen a boy his height who, as far as he knew, was 7. Drawing from this encounter, Fenrir assumed they were peers in age. Rosaline's face donned a pensive look as she absorbed his experience. She reasoned if he referred to the past, that boy must be gone. Fenrir remained sprawled in the branches, gazing skyward. Rosalind wondered aloud whether he wished to live among his own people in that place Nora had described. With a hint of apathy, he regarded her and asked, "Then what happens? What's next for me?" The girl said he could be granted citizenship or go wherever he pleased. As someone accustomed to captivity, Fenrir was skeptical such marvels were possible. He spoke of being captured on a distant continent, fleeing thrice, and recaptured on his 4th attempt. Rosalind wordlessly paid heed to all he shared. It seemed to him that pleasant places were out of reach, for the threat of being taken could return at any instant. Fenrir's sense security evaporated too quickly. Rosalind, thoughtfully listening to him, pictured what his life might hold beyond the orphanage's walls. Unease shaded her features. Carelessly, the girl wandered beneath the tree where the young man then posed if he wished to remain there. Fenrir's expression remained stoic as he expressed he felt no attachment to any one place, merely a distaste for being passed from spot to spot like a helpless bundle. The splendid dusk cast a soft glow across his visage, making his gaze gleam more vividly. He regarded the natural surroundings with pure wonder. The heavens were brushed in a soft golden hue as the sun edged behind a tall, noble mountain. Admiring the flawless scene, Fenrir announced his intent to go there directly, since he felt he didn't belong in the manor regardless. The happiness inspired by the sunset faded swiftly from his face, surrendering to sorrow. With particular grief, he remarked, "Besides, what I want hardly ever factors in. At least right now, nobody's trading me off somewhere." An uneasy feeling clung to Rosaline. Although Fenrir saw her as a rescuer, she couldn't shake this subtle worry. Had the Duchess known this sentiment before? Or was it a sensation entirely new? Lifting her eyes proudly, she realized the truth. It was a deep awareness of her own responsibility. Without hesitating, Rosaline called out to Fenrir, promising that she wouldn't hinder him if he chose to stay. The soft glow of sunset highlighted Fenrir's face, enriching the hopeful glimmer now lighting his eyes. Steadfastly, Rosaline pressed her hand to her chest and added, "But only if you agree to follow my rules." Fenrir's face sharpened with displeasure. Frowning, he turned his gaze to her. Eager to clarify, Rosaline quickly explained she could just as well let Fenrir go to the capital whenever she decided. She imposed no such demands if she saw him as a servant to be owned. She emphasized that while servants must heed her, they were by no means enslaved. Fenrir inquired with conviction as to what they were, if not slaves, and the young woman serenely responded, servants, or perhaps employees. With a crooked smile, the youth remarked that he could hardly see any distinction between the two. Contradicting his opinion, the Duchess retorted that slaves are never granted the liberty to select their master, while servants are. Her gaze falling downward and a sigh fluttering from her lips, the girl continued, "You longed for the freedom of choice, didn't you? Now the power is in your hands." In answer to Rosaline's comment, Fenrir raised his eyebrows in a forlorn manner and questioned why she was entrusting him with this decision. The radiant sun's brilliance caressed the Duchess's outline, the breeze stirring her uniform and glinting off her golden locks. Upon hearing his inquiry, she pondered quietly. Why, indeed? Golden curls tumbling over her shoulders, Rosaline met his gaze unwaveringly and responded with composed authority that she was the Duchess of Appledon, reminding Fenrir that he had walked into her domain, and added, had she taken in a lost cat, she wouldn't have sent it beneath the wheels of a carriage. Taken aback by her words, Fenrir stood motionless, his bright amber eyes round with shock and a hint of bewilderment. She noted that if the stray chose to run away, she would be powerless to stop it. Fenrir's ears flickered uneasily, as though her remark had struck a tender chord within him. Facing Fenrir, Rosaline set new terms. He must come to the table and take his meals with everyone. From now on, no one would be trailing after him, spoon in hand. Having voiced everything she needed to say, the Duchess paced away at a languid tempo, leaving the young man alone among his swirling reflections. Fenrir lingered upon a sturdy branch of the ancient tree, quietly turning over the girl's words in his mind. The next morning, Rosaline was savoring the gentle comfort of aromatic tea, when one of the servants approached to inquire how the Duchess felt about Fenrir possibly returning. With near absence of affect, Rosaline answered that the choice belonged to Fenrir alone. Notice was suddenly drawn to the balcony doorway behind Rosaline. The maid's gaze registered confusion. With a jolt, the large gilded door abruptly flung open, as though the action had taken everyone by surprise. Fenrir manifested in the entranceway, prompting the maid to yelp in alarm at the unexpected sight. Only a single day gone, Fenrir declared with certainty that his choice was to remain on the estate, prompting the Duchess to formally present herself, Rosaline Idris Appledon. For his part, the young man had presumed that Your Highness was the girl's name, as everyone addressed her so, and he said as much to her. Holding her fine porcelain cup, the girl told him gently that he may, if so inclined, continue to call her that. As warm sunshine flooded the grounds, Fenrir remained in Rosaline's home, yet not once did he ever address her as Your Highness. Rosaline returned to the estate after concluding her business. A sumptuous fur-trimmed uniform spread over her form and her cane poised elegantly in her grasp. A cheerful maid greeted her lady warmly, lending a hand with her elaborate attire. The Duchess inquired after Fenrir's whereabouts. The servant answered back that Fenrir was quietly lost in a book in his chamber. When Rosaline entered, the young man met her eyes steadily from within his room. When she entered, the Duchess settled cautiously into a chair, careful not to interrupt his deep immersion in the world of his book. As she observed Fenrir reading, the young woman found herself mentally remarking on a certain quiet dignity in him, one too grand for a mere child, what she deemed a trait born within him. There was a penetrating and thoughtful quality to her gaze. Interest sparkled in the girl's eyes as she studied Fenrir. These little moments never failed to remind the Duchess of her beloved cat, contentedly draped beside the hearth on frostbitten nights. Sensing himself watched, Fenrir inquired what was amiss, but Rosaline simply dismissed his concern. The thoughts swarming within her remained unspoken. Since Fenrir chose the estate as his residence, time had passed peacefully. Content with this new existence, the youth savored its calm, though turbulence surfaced one day when Rosaline and Fenrir quarreled. Glaring down at Fenrir, the Duchess knitted her brows. With an edge in her voice, she remarked, "You claimed it made no difference to you." Fenrir, justifying what he'd said, clarified his indifference to matters of quality. Rosaline listened closely, all the while resting her palm on the violet coat on the table, thoughtfully readied by the butler. Growing more exasperated, the youth gestured emphatically to his shorts, making it clear how the choice of his outfit displeased him. With irritation, Fenrir exclaimed that this attire was fit only for a 7-year-old child. Meanwhile, Rosaline pressed her fist to her lips, barely suppressing laughter, somewhat amused that his clothing didn't align with his protests. Rosaline replied with composed tact, suggesting that he looked splendid, then, with a subtle tease, added that even 10-year-olds might wear the same. In frustration, Fenrir retorted, insisting he was anything but a little boy. Lifting the violet coat, Rosaline, with outward tranquility, challenged him. "Oh, in that case, show me." In an instant, the tranquility on the girl's face gave way to a flash of alarm. Fenrir slashed his clawed hand towards her, and she swiftly ducked out of the attack's reach. The Duchess crashed to the floor as Fenrir shoved her, and the room's furnishings toppled alongside them, scattering items the butler had neatly arranged. Fenrir grasped Rosaline by the neck while she gazed up at him, dumbstruck. Rage glimmered in the young man's eyes. Fenrir bristled at her belittlement. Hovering above her, he snarled, "Don't treat me as if I am a mere child." Swelling with indignation, Fenrir cautioned the Duchess. She mustn't underestimate him just because his limbs were short. Yet before he got another word out, Rosaline lithely slipped free from his grasp, leaving Fenrir off balance. As confusion flickered in the youth's eyes, the girl set her hand on his arm for an instant. With practiced ease, the Duchess planted Fenrir's face against the floor, asserting coolly that the issue had nothing to do with his stature. Regaining her serene expression, Rosaline perched atop Fenrir, gripping his head, adding that he had yet to comprehend his own abilities. Casting a commanding look downward, she let Fenrir know in no uncertain terms. Warnings would come from her, not the reverse. Confusion lingered as Rosaline guided Fenrir to understand that her life, contrary to what he might imagine, was far from a tale of pure delight. Noticing Fenrir's anger fading, Rosaline withdrew, leaving him with questions yet to ponder. The Duchess addressed the maid, instructing her to summon a tailor to craft a new wardrobe for Fenrir. Startled and fumbling, the maid managed a timid assent, glancing at her attire. Soiled and defiled during Fenrir's assault, Rosaline instructed the staff to have them destroyed by fire. From that day forward, Fenrir no longer found the courage to act out against Rosaline. The Duchess sat poised, hands folded upon the table before her. Fenrir's composure in the days since revealed to her that an understanding had been forged between them. A young maiden sat opposite a youth, furiously scribbling words into a notebook. They were enveloped by a sea of books scattered atop the table and the floor below. Fenrir's education proved to be a persistent concern for the young woman. Her illustrious standing precluded her from employing a learned instructor for the captive. Rosaline Idris Appledon, formerly a princess, now bore the distinguished honor of being a duchess. Her constant company consisted of nobles and other eminent individuals. All prospective tutors in her circle were themselves blue-blooded. Noblemen from birth would, in truth, never condescend to the task of educating a prisoner, no matter the Duchess's orders. Glancing at the book, Fenrir questioned Rosaline about why he must study. The young woman replied calmly, saying it was to prevent him from being duped into signing his own enslavement. After carefully considering her options, Rosaline reached the conclusion that she herself would make a better teacher for the young man. Still, the Duchess realized that to impart everything, from the nuances of decorum to the rudiments of arithmetic, would be a daunting challenge for one person. Unexpectedly, Fenlir revealed himself to possess a striking intellect. He absorbed every lesson at an astonishing pace. In merely half an hour, he conquered the basics of the alphabet. Moments later, as if charmed, he was reading with ease. Fenlir was never hesitant to seek answers to what he did not know, and his eyes sparkled even more eagerly in the midst of study. Time allotted to learning slipped by swiftly and pleasantly, with Fenlir proving a delightfully gifted pupil. As dusk blended its soft tapestry over the manor, the mellow evening crept through the grand windows, bathing corridors in sumptuous gold. Fenlir wandered unhurriedly through the hallway, exuding a newfound assurance with every step. Approaching one of the house's many rooms, the young man noticed a foot poking from beyond an open door, hesitantly reaching into the hall. Fenlir's keen gaze sharpened, betraying alarm and skepticism. A workman of the estate created an obstacle for Fenlir, his foot placed like a casual barricade, yet Fenlir breezed deftly over it. The man's expression wore a silent apology, strangely contrite before Fenlir. The youth bestowed upon him a chilly glare, as if harboring mistrust or suspicion toward the servant. With narrowed gaze and a deepening frown, Fenlir queried, "Well, did you need something from me?" The worker faltered, awkwardly scratching his nape. A serving girl hurried up, gently removing the man from Fenlir's path, then anxiously checked whether Fenlir had hurt himself in the process. The youth stood unspeaking, provoking the girl's abrupt turn towards the man as she chastised him with growing ire, insisting upon an apology. In a subdued voice, the man muttered he had not witnessed Fenlir offering his regrets. Fenlir regarded the exchange with a certain contempt, electing not to say a single word. Shortly after, the young man pressed forward at a brisk pace, leaving the pair behind him. Words uttered by a serving girl from behind brought Fenlir to a halt. Facing the man, she told him that if his intention was to taunt, he ought to have done it skillfully. Taken aback by her retort, Fenlir paused and looked. The man declared he hadn't expected the young fellow to evade, yet the maid was quick to point out Fenlir's sharpened instincts. Among themselves, the manor's servants whispered persistently about Fenlir, highlighting how they only tolerated his presence, unable to fathom Rosaline's fondness for him. With unabashed candor, they discussed Fenlir's ignorance of station as typical for any captive, all the while the slighted youth remained standing near them, stunned. The same maid who had just supported Fenlir smirked with dry amusement, remarking how she enjoyed the young fellow's pretense at significance. The man echoed her sentiment. Their gossip became so spirited that Fenlir, who could hear their mocking quite clearly, was entirely forgotten by them, even as his anger grew. With a look of contempt, Fenlir squeezed his hands into fists. Gazing wistfully through the window, the young man asked Rosaline, "How much longer will I have to stay here?" The Duchess stopped just as she was about to drink her tea. Fenlir's inquiry surprised her, and lifting her gaze to him, puzzled. Feigning confusion, she inquired what he meant by, quote, "until when?" prompting Fenlir to explain that surely Rosaline didn't expect him to live at the manor forever. Letting out a quiet sigh as she set her cup down, Rosaline stretched and responded, "You are free to leave whenever you wish." As the rich scent of brewed tea filled the room and fine china sat upon the table, Fenlir asked when that day would arrive, prompting Rosaline to remind him that nothing is everlasting, and thus the time would come. Fenlir's penetrating gaze captured her words fully, as Rosaline added by noting that there were still occasions when Fenlir did not enjoy her company. The girl idly turned the pages of her book. Fenlir swiftly dismissed her reasoning with a brief rejoinder. Rosaline lifted her eyes toward the youth expectantly, waiting for him to elaborate. Casting his gaze downward, Fenlir slowly stood up from his place. As he walked by the Duchess, Fenlir quietly confessed, sorrow lacing his words, that there had never been any dislike for her in his heart. He exited quietly, leaving Rosaline lost in her own musings. Astonishment filled Rosaline's expression. Her mind spun as she digested Fenrir's confession. From the Duchess's perspective, Fenrir's compliance might be credited to her own gentle taming. Or perhaps the youth had simply chosen to stop contesting her assertions altogether. Peering into her tea and catching her own reflection, Rosaline pondered the true reason why Fenrir lingered at the estate. Yet she dared not voice the question, worried she might be unprepared for the reply, or that the answer itself could unnerve her. She could not determine which fear held greater sway in her heart. The grand hallway basked in gentle illumination, sunlight slipping through the slender arched windows, revealing a view of the flawless sky beyond. Out of growing habit, Fenrir found himself walking these halls yet again, carrying out Rosaline's request to fetch tomes from the library. With arms overloaded by stacks of books, Fenrir's sight was nearly swallowed, leading him to muse on why so much reading material was needed. Suddenly, Fenrir's path was blocked by a pair of figures, both tall, cloaked in finery that bespoke their considerable wealth. Dressed in raven tones, one of the men responded to Fenrir's presence with the airs of an elitist, wrinkling his nose in a theatrical gesture and surveying Fenrir most disdainfully. Never before had Fenrir encountered this aristocrat within the estate, so he eyed him with interest. The nobleman, meanwhile, openly muttered, "Why is there a servant wandering this corridor?" His companion was none other than Rosaline's hired knight, who, visibly uncertain, responded with care, assuring that the young man was, in fact, not a servant. Fenrir scrutinized the pair, piqued by curiosity as to just whom this statuesque aristocrat might be. The noble expressed bafflement, inquiring, "Then if he's no servant, what is he supposed to be? Kept as a spare on the chance he's needed?" The knight at the nobleman's side leaned closer, quietly murmuring that this was a child under her highness's guardianship. Fenrir's even gaze stayed fixed upon them, his expression remaining composed and unrevealing. The noble's mouth twisted into a malevolent grin. With condescension, he contemplated Fenrir, unable to fathom why Rosaline would choose a captive as her ward. He remarked flippantly that apparently she desired another companion, as if the previous ones were insufficient. Displeased by such crude likening and brazen disrespect, Fenrir returned a look filled with unmasked disdain toward the arrogant gentleman. The distinguished gentleman named Lucian found it unimaginable that the Duchess would make Fenrir her protégé. His eyes sharp with scorn, Lucian speculated whether Rosaline lacked official duties now that she busied herself nurturing this wild creature. Seething with rage, Fenrir fixed a silent, furious gaze upon him. Once again, the youth could feel the pointed glances of open hostility directed his way. Abruptly, Lucian raised his cane in a threatening arc overhead. Fenrir recoiled unexpectedly, anxiety flickering within his shining eyes. With agile reflexes, Fenrir swerved clear of the strike, but this left him stumbling shakily off balance. His book slipped to the ground, the silence shaken by a loud fluttering of paper. Anxiously, Fenrir saw his textbooks fall, for these were meant for his upcoming lesson with Rosaline. He remembered, as Rosaline herself had told him, those volumes contained all the most essential knowledge for his well-being. With his fury reignited by Lucian's act, Fenrir flashed a hostile smirk. Sir Eliot, Lucian's attendant, looked on in stunned confusion, though the nobleman remained stoic. Fenrir wrinkled his nose and threw the noble a cold, disparaging look. But before he could move away fully, Lucian's cane landed right atop his head. Covering his trembling lips, Sir Eliot stared in shock while Fenrir tried to gather himself from the floor. Lost for words, the knight stood uncertain, and Lucian wore his revulsion openly. Shielding his vision, Fenrir pressed his hand firmly to his aching skull. Gazing at his palm, he spied smears of bright blood upon his skin. Directing his cane at Fenrir, Lucian instructed Eliot to remove him from the house, his thoughts also wandering to Rosaline's whereabouts. When her name was spoken, Fenrir's face burned with renewed agitation. Wearing an expression of marked disdain, Lucian questioned how Fenrir dared to glare so boldly, warning this would not be the only punishment. As he made to land another blow, the aristocrat remarked that misbehaving dogs had only one end, as Fenrir swiftly dodged. Without delay, Fenrir sprang and aimed a punch right at Lucian's jaw. At once, the gentleman collapsed, his skull making a heavy sound upon the ground. Satisfied by his retribution, Fenrir mused that the nobleman was indeed foolish, unable to withstand even a simple blow. Sir Elliot fussed anxiously about Lucian, questioning his well-being with concern. Seething with humiliation, he loudly derided Fenrir as an unclean servant, making his fury plain to all. Disregarding Lucian entirely, the young man brushed himself off with composure as he regained his breath. Without hesitation, he dashed toward Rosaline, even as the nobleman shouted for help restraining him. Elsewhere, the Duchess, unaware of any chaos, quietly enjoyed her tea in her private quarters. Easing herself into her seat, Rosaline considered pausing Fenrir's lessons, longing for a tranquil tea break. From down the hallway, the sound of footsteps soon drew her gaze. Fenrir promptly appeared and thrust the doors open with a clamorous entry. Panting for breath, the young man stared at the Duchess, wide-eyed. He climbed unceremoniously onto the table, even as Rosaline demanded to know where the books she'd requested had gone. Standing so near her that only a breath lay between them, he urged the Duchess to follow him. Gazing serenely at him, Rosaline reminded him of her request not to step onto the table, repeating her inquiry about the missing books. Nevertheless, Fenrir simply waved his arms and insisted it was of no consequence at this moment. Restless, he gingerly drew her hand, trying to show her his injury. For a heartbeat, Rosaline was stunned, and then looked at Fenrir with real concern. On further scrutiny, she saw a streak of blood at his hairline. It was just then that Sir Elliot stormed in, clearly alarmed, to which Rosaline asked for an explanation. Right after Elliot came an incensed Lucian, eyes sharply seeking Fenrir, menace on his lips. Catching sight of Rosaline, he twisted his mouth into a bitter smile and greeted her disdainfully. Having already sized up the nobleman, Fenrir regarded him with barely contained hostility. Standing up, the Duchess remarked that Lucian likely had not met Sir Elliot before this encounter. Facing the knight, she reminded him firmly that guests must be announced before entering the estate. Elliot attempted to offer an explanation, while Lucian unabashedly remarked that conversing with the Duchess was never simple. Rosaline then inquired about his visit, and he replied with self-assurance that, as her husband, it was within his rights. Fenrir was rather startled upon hearing these words. With resolute certainty, Rosaline delivered a sharp slap to Lucian's cheek. Her bold gesture left every soul in the chamber motionless, awestruck by her resolve. Lucian, quivering with fury, longed to hurl another biting remark at the young woman, but he moved too slowly, and the Duchess's knee found his midriff with the swiftness of thunder. For a moment, silence reigned as the nobleman sprawled on the floor, struggling for breath through the pain. Without hesitation, the Duchess reached out and claimed Elliot's weapon for herself. In an instant, the blade hovered menacingly at Lucian's neck. Rosaline fixed her gaze upon him, declaring that to besmirch the imperial house was an infraction punishable by death itself. At that, an anxious Lucian stammered that His Majesty was well aware of his presence. With a look of disdain, the Duchess listened as he insisted he would never affix his seal to the divorce, all the while stressing his imperial connection. Having no insight into Lucian's intention, Rosaline offered a sarcastic kind of pity. Composed, she pointed out his stamp was futile, as their union had concluded the day she sent those divorce documents. Placing the sword beneath his fingers, the Duchess ridiculed his innocence with a taunt. She voiced a playful desire to sever Lucian's head, emphasizing she hardly required any seal to proceed. Aloud, she mused about telling His Majesty that Lucian had signed away his marriage and succumbed to sorrow, with only a severed finger as memento. Yet, Rosaline pondered if she should instead take a live finger, but admitted such pain would make it difficult to feign death from grief. Recoiling, gripped by fear, Lucian cried out that despite all her threats, she was still, technically, not free from their bond. The Duchess gazed at him in stern silence as he claimed he'd accepted any future lovers and only wished she'd abandon her harshness. Pointing her sword at his neck, she warned him to keep quiet, clarifying she ended things because of his foolishness, never due to infidelity. Letting the blade drift down, she added pointedly that he made an even poorer companion than a husband. Rosaline flashed a wry smile, remarking that if this was the honesty he sought, he finally received it. Fenrir, never having witnessed this fierce aspect of the Duchess before, watched them quietly, astonished. Rosaline left Lucian with a caution. He was never to lay a hand on another soul in her domain, lest he lose what dignity he had left. The Duchess beheld Lucian, now consumed by a crushing sense of disgrace. Wordlessly, he drifted about, letting a small case glide onto the desktop with a careless toss. He quickly made his escape as if fleeing the very grip of doom. Chances were, that box contained a formally printed divorce agreement. Inwardly, Rosaline mourned Lucian's departure, wishing the spectacle had lingered a bit longer. The Duchess extended the sword towards Sir Elliot, directing her attention his way. With a sweet but sly grin, she cautioned him that, should he admit another trespasser, she'd hold him not by the sword, but by the throat next time. A shiver crept down Elliot's back at her chilling words. Rosaline advised him, "Suppress your pride and consult your superiors if you're in doubt about a visitor." Her eyes shifted to Fenrir, and she asked him not to force her to repeat such words. Fenrir, perched atop the table, offered her only quiet observation all this while. At last he hopped down willingly, setting off in pursuit of the departing Rosaline. Soon after, both were settled in the apothecary, the Duchess preparing to inspect Fenrir's injury. Thankfully, the gash was minor. A bit of salve would do the trick. Quietly relieved, Rosaline thought it fortunate, for otherwise the doctor would be summoned, and Fenrir would surely object. As she reached for the healing balm, the Duchess gently notified Fenrir that the application might bring a slight sting. She softly pressed at his wound, causing Fenrir to scrunch up his nose, remarking she needn't bother. She concurred with his sentiment, yet noted with relief that the injury appeared to be recovering. Their faces drew unusually close as Rosaline concentrated on the care, holding his chin steady, while Fenrir's eyes sharpened and his pulse thudded violently, feeling ready to burst from his chest. Ruffled by this, Fenrir briskly averted his gaze and shielded his eyes. Concerned, the Duchess inquired whether she'd caused him discomfort, and Fenrir assured her it was nothing. Treatment complete, Fenrir clutched at his chest in confusion, unable to decipher the strange flutter within. After a moment's stillness, he mentioned he hadn't realized Rosaline was married. With quiet composure, she explained that whatever their marriage had once meant was lost, and her feelings for that man had faded to nothing. Perplexed, Fenrir asked what reason there was for such a union if affection was absent. Surprised, Rosaline replied that marriage doesn't require love any more than love guarantees marriage. Gesturing broadly, she remarked that people rarely wed for love alone, and for nobles like herself that rule was doubly true. Fenrir looked utterly bewildered by the situation, a confusion that Rosaline picked up on with ease. As she mulled things over, she recalled that those of half-beast lineage chose just one soulmate for their entire existence. Judging from the troubled look on the young man's visage, Rosaline sensed his unhappiness. Yet Fenrir expressed his sense that everything felt unjust. Adding to his case, Fenrir remarked that answers usually followed whenever he asked, but in this situation, the girl had been silent. He folded his arms firmly across his chest, waiting intently for her reaction, his injury visible to Rosaline. Letting out a gentle sigh, the Duchess decided to grant him the freedom to inquire. No sooner had she done so than Fenrir barraged her with curiosity about what had led her and Lucian to wed. Rosaline commented on her surprise at his interest in this matter. The young man replied that Lucian didn't exactly give off a benevolent impression. With a trace of melancholy, Rosaline confessed that Lucian had been the least suitable among those who might have asked for her hand. Fenrir wondered aloud whether she had intentionally sought such a match, but Rosaline explained it had never been her decision. Contemplating her own response, the Duchess gazed through the window and disclosed that it was her mother who had selected her spouse. She elaborated that her mother felt assigning Rosaline a man with flaws might inspire her to reform him. Studying the girl, Fenrir could swear that, for just an instant, her eyes took on an almost hollow quality. Finding it hard to accept that one's own mother could act that way, the young man sought assurance that he had truly interpreted Rosaline's words as intended. Yet Rosaline reaffirmed her story with composed assurance. The Duchess's mother had always favored extravagant dresses festooned with finery. She loved to appear at grand occasions in them, parading her flair among other guests. Rosaline recounted how her mother had hoped her daughter would place priority on caring for herself and nurturing future offspring. As she spoke, Fenrir couldn't help but conjure an image in his mind of Rosaline attired in an evening gown with vivid cosmetics. In his eyes, that vision clashed with the spontaneous, daring side he saw in her. These musings caught the young man off guard, while Rosaline gave him a curious glance, oblivious to the reverie consuming him. Carrying on, the Duchess told how, from a young age, she had been drawn to swordplay, and her adeptness naturally flourished. At just 7 years old, she had unhesitatingly bested her brother in a bout. She was well liked by the knights and seized any moment she could to showcase her competencies and confidence. But her mother suspected her ambitions masked a scheme to muster an army and seize power, never realizing Rosaline's true love for the way of the blade. Her mother dissuaded her at every turn, always insisting this path was not meant for her, and that even perfecting swordplay would offer her no benefit. Recalling her mother's declarations, Rosaline admitted to herself that intrigue had never appealed to her, and she harbored not the faintest ambition for the throne. Fenrir, hearing the Duchess's account, regarded her with eyes tinged both by surprise and regret. In the girl's mind, marriage to Lucian was a ploy to sabotage her influence, since such a pair was unlikely to make effective monarchs. To mend her image, Rosaline resolved to seek another marriage through divorce, yet she argued that such a step was impossible, prompting Fenrir to inquire why. She then explained that ending a marriage demanded the emperor's seal on the papers, and that her father unfailingly backed her mother. Rosaline understood that broaching the subject of divorce with her parents would be seen as reaching for royal power. Even hinting at affection for another would draw her parents to scrutinize them. According to the Duchess's own admission, the only freedom her parents left her was to quietly maintain a discreet relationship elsewhere. Had Rosaline truly yearned for the crown, she would have readily pushed Lucian aside. She would then firmly seek support in a new union with someone more politic, for such an alliance would rally noble favor behind her. After all, with the throne came the power to dissolve a marriage. Yet, attaining that seat required an unrelenting struggle. But Rosaline honestly had no wish to pursue that path. Losing the struggle for succession entailed exile, or worse, demise, and even victory brought persistent anxieties as ruler. If crowned, Rosaline would be forced into exhausting labor, cautious not to rouse discord, ever on guard against those close to her. The Duchess's heart was hardly consumed by dreams of statesmanship. Daily life suited her contentedly as it was. These subtler truths she elected not to reveal to Fenrir. With an emperor's passing, the seal could be affixed, and the dissolution permitted. So Rosaline recounted to the young man that upon the sovereign's death, she at once finalized the documents. Fenrir watched her sorrowfully when she confessed, in all honesty, that summoning the will to do so was beyond her, but Lucian persistently refused to sign. Looking back, Rosaline suspected her former spouse was merely shielding the emperor. For, indeed, this emperor seemed just as likely to champion Lucian's interests over those of his only sister. His outlook on Rosaline echoed her parents. He saw her as obstinate and lacking in gratitude, while Lucian, he believed, was but an unfortunate husband enduring the hardships of a wayward spouse. As she recalled the whole ordeal, the Duchess could only find it farcical. Bringing her tale to a close, Rosaline summarized the full affair surrounding Lucian, noting she'd expelled him half a year after his arrival. Then, for a time, silence filled the chamber. Fenrir hung his head, lost in solemn thought. Breaking the quiet, Rosaline spoke up as she reminisced how the youth had passionately pleaded with her to go away with him. Her utterance sent Fenrir's pulse racing once more. The girl, smiling, inquired whether he was shielding her from Lucian's influence. Uncertain of how to reply, Fenrir watched her in mute bewilderment, his eyes widening. In that instant, his face flushed a deep violet tint, uneasy beneath Rosaline's probing. The young man stumbled over his words, hesitating as he searched for what to say. Suddenly, a memory flashed before him. Slave traders, harshly dragging away another of his kin. The look those merchants wore back then resembled Lucian's demeanor, so Fenrir reasoned that folks like that seldom acted out of kindness. Rosaline met his answer with a skeptical look and observed that anyone wishing her harm would not stroll in through the main entrance. She remarked, "Such people might sneak in through windows or snare me with tainted meals." Fenrir pondered, wondering who might desire her ill. Rosaline reassured him softly that he needn't trouble himself, for what was bound to happen could not be helped. The Duchess, laying a gentle hand atop his, promised she would keep him safe, insisting he needn't worry about anyone threatening him. Upon hearing these words, Fenrir was visibly shocked, turning questioning eyes upon her. Rosaline went on in a measured voice, saying not a soul would dare harm Fenrir even if sinister ones targeted her. With a trace of firmness, the young man protested, saying his distress was not for himself. In full earnest, the Duchess advised instead, should peril approach her, Fenrir ought to flee and conceal himself at once. Her gaze falling, she elaborated, whether in a tree or under a bed, what mattered most was that he remain unharmed. Fenrir's eyes filled with sorrow, for what he truly wished to say was that her safety, not his own, weighed on his mind. Utterly untroubled, the Duchess noted that if she were lost, Fenrir could escape to Nora, offering to share her address with him. Inwardly, Rosaline mused that nothing assured Nora's safety either should disaster strike, though the woman knew their plight, and that was sufficient. Leaping glumly from the table, the youth declared his capability of defending his own being. Gesturing towards himself now, he went on to assert that Rosaline could count on him for protection too. With an unreadable expression, the Duchess remarked on his 4 failed escape attempts, noting nonetheless his impressive agility. Yet, in Rosaline's judgment, such skills would not suffice against an adversary such as Lucian. Sensing his distress, the girl added, as if thoughtfully, that there was no disgrace in weakness. One needed only to allow oneself to be cared for. Her remark once again summoned a heavy, loaded silence into the space. At that, Fenrir quickly moved toward the doorway, prompting Rosaline's sharp question about his intended destination. Pausing at the threshold, he declared his intent to retrieve the books scattered by the Duchess's spouse. Rosaline cried out, warning him not to call Lucian that. Professing her deep aversion to the man, Fenrir merely scowled ahead, refusing to answer her words. In turn, Rosaline unhappily turned her back to him. Left alone, the Duchess remarked that Fenrir may have been in his early 20s, but he behaved childishly. With tempests in his stride, the young man marched determinedly down the corridor. Halting, he lifted both hands to inspect them carefully. All at once, Fenrir drew himself up straight, energizing every muscle from his head to his feet. He recalled the criticism he'd faced about how slowly he matured physically. Yet, since arriving at this grand house, he could sense subtle transformations in himself. Rosaline's kindness and considerate demeanor appeared to produce some real effect. With an abrupt gesture, Fenrir yanked off his blindfold. He immediately darted off, sprinting briskly down the hallway's length. Privately, the young man resolved that should Lucian return, this time, he would be prepared. It mattered little to Fenrir whether Rosaline approved or not. Abandoning her was not in his plans. The day that followed brought gloomy skies, usually a sign that heavy rain was imminent. People traversed the street in various directions, every wanderer driven by a unique purpose, from invitation to obligation. A splendid ivory carriage pulled up a good distance from the bustling throng. From its interior stepped Rosaline alongside Fenrir, whose ears and tail remained cleverly concealed by his outfit. Rosaline turned toward Fenrir, inquiring where he would prefer to go next. As she watched him awaiting his response, a doubt flickered within the Duchess. Reminiscing, she realized that since Lucien's visit, neither she nor Fenrir had uttered his name. Though Lucien never set foot in the mansion again after shouting his threat, Fenrir remained alert for him each passing day. Yet, with a mountain of assignments demanding his attention, the young man had little choice but to set thoughts of Lucien aside. Sometime earlier, Rosaline had handed him a crucial document, insisting he commit its message to memory. When he scanned the written words, he discovered Morin's home address inscribed there. Though part beast by blood, Morin had managed to claim the rights of a citizen. Whispers told that she guided an orphanage for discarded slave children. Wondering if Fenrir could interpret directions, she soon realized he'd need instruction on that skill. He replied by articulating the address aloud, which led Rosaline to observe that he didn't have the means to actually reach the place. Standing from her chair, the Duchess proposed they stroll through the city together, remarking upon her wish to purchase weaponry. At the same time, she mentioned she would point out Morin's residence to Fenrir, prompting him to ask for its purpose. After she pondered a reply in silence, Rosaline regarded the discontent twisting his features. She went on to reassure him that securing at least one more concealed refuge was wise, since shelter does not always present itself. Fenrir replied that people were startled by his unusual tail and ears, but Rosaline dismissed this, pointing out that plenty of his kind coexisted calmly in the Empire. Fenrir fell quiet, with a shade of unease settling into the space between them. Rosaline inhaled, offering that he was free to speak his mind, should he desire. Gripping tightly the slip of paper bearing Morin's address, Fenrir reassured her that he was fine. With that, Rosaline silently motioned for him to follow her out. With gentle encouragement, the Duchess managed to coax Fenrir outside into the open air. Bending toward the youth, Rosaline inquired where his interest lay, and Fenrir explained that her errand was to purchase a sword. The young woman pointed out that there was no need to hurry, and pressed him again. The young man confessed he simply didn't know what the city offered. His eyes darting restlessly, he gripped his hat while the Duchess sensed that he was indifferent to touring the town. Surveying his demeanor, she suggested it was likely born of the harsh world he'd grown up in. Rosaline understood this lesson couldn't be delivered all at once. She dreamed of revealing unimagined sights to stretch his horizons. The Duchess encouraged him to shadow her, inviting him to cast his gaze around. A tender smile gracing her lips, she said she would guide Fenrir to Morin's doorstep. Her radiance struck the young man afresh, his heart suddenly racing with emotion. Nonetheless, he composed himself with haste, dutifully keeping pace behind Rosaline. Observing how anxiously the young man fidgeted with his hat, the Duchess reassured him softly, "No one will notice your ears." Afterward, they began a slow and easy walk together through the area. Rosaline pointed out the notable sights, yet Fenrir continually glanced about, unable to settle his nerves. He glanced back yet again and, distracted, allowed himself to fall slightly behind Rosaline. An uneasy sense, as though someone's gaze was burningly fixed on him, accompanied his every step. Eventually, telling himself it was only his imagination, Fenrir's nerves eased for a moment until the vague silhouette of a woman manifested behind him. An elderly woman ran into him unexpectedly. Unsteady, he lost his footing, and his hat tumbled off. Horrified, Fenrir stared at the fallen hat, waves of panic surging through him. Instinctively clutching his ears, Fenrir became consumed by the fear of anyone catching a glimpse of them. The old woman promptly expressed regret, explaining that her poor eyesight had caused the mishap. When Fenrir understood she hadn't yet noticed his distinguishing feature, some measure of serenity returned to him. He snatched up his hat in a flash and, almost on instinct, placed it securely back in place. A quick survey of his surroundings reassured Fenrir. No other pedestrians had witnessed the incident. Only now did he let himself exhale deeply, calming himself down as he sat at the edge of the pavement. The elderly woman addressed him again, and a fresh rush of anxiety overwhelmed Fenrir when he realized a small crowd was gathering. A voice came from among the curious, inquiring about the commotion, and the explanation given was he had unexpectedly taken a seat right there in the street. With gentle concern, the old woman's hand settled on his shoulder, and she questioned if perhaps he'd ever fallen out on the road before. A dull sky subdued the bustling city even further. The leaves whirled gracefully in the heavy, brewing atmosphere overhead. At that same time, Rosaline arrived at her target location. Not yet aware she'd lost Fenrir, she kept up her account as though still speaking to him, promising to share tips on how to pinpoint the desired address. Pausing at the firearm shop, the girl exclaimed with lively satisfaction that they had made it to the proper spot. She scanned around, and the realization of Fenrir's absence settled over her with clear alarm. It wasn't long before Fenrir rejoined Rosaline, almost instantly. Relief was clear as the girl breathed out. She was simply glad Fenrir had merely fallen behind rather than gone missing. Fenrir's labored breaths startled Rosaline, and she felt rising concern for his state. Bending close to him, the Duchess inquired if he felt well and questioned the reason for his heavy perspiration. Choosing not to share the specifics of his recent escapade, Fenrir replied that all was well. Placing her hands on his shoulders, the Duchess remarked that a healthy man does not appear as he did. With genuine worry, Rosaline advised that he head home early if strolling proved troublesome. Drawing her hand away, Fenrir insisted there was no issue at all. Gesturing toward the store, the young man proposed that they go inside after all. Rosaline, though her unease lingered, nodded in agreement with his suggestion. Once inside together, it soon dawned on them that this was certainly not a firearms shop. The shelves displayed an array of graceful canes in a myriad of styles and hues. Upon looking around, Rosaline felt relieved that nothing had changed. The proprietor welcomed them warmly, and Rosaline, mentioning it had been ages since they had last met, inquired after his well-being. After straightening his spectacles, the gentleman observed her more intently, soon discerning Rosaline's identity. Commenting that he had not initially recalled her, the man shook her hand, joking that grown ladies ought not be breaking canes nowadays. Back in the day, the Duchess would wield her cane like a weapon, paying little mind to a man's warnings, hence her nickname for the shop. With a shy glance, Rosaline replied that the shopkeeper remembered her old mischief as though it happened just last day. Returning her look with a smile, he noted that even a decade-old day seemed almost as close as yesterday. Spotting Fenrir, he politely wondered about the identity of the young companion. Seeking cover behind Rosaline, Fenrir felt disinclined to introduce himself, and the Duchess announced her wish for some new canes. The shopkeeper informed them of some recent additions upstairs, which Rosaline expressed interest in seeing. Rosaline and Fenrir followed the gentleman as the young man playfully commented on fencing with a cane. The Duchess recounted that, as a child, her mother forbade her from bearing a sword except during lessons, leading to a resentment she shouldn't have to defend. With a grin, Fenrir wondered aloud why she was offering explanations then. Fenrir's jesting only further inflamed Rosaline's irritation. Pausing at the base of the stairway, the man asked whether they wished to ascend. Glancing at Fenrir, Rosaline questioned if he was interested in going up. In reply, the young man, unruffled, remarked that he intended to remain downstairs. The Duchess found his composure pleasing. She assured him of her quick return, asking that he refrain from disturbing anything. While examining the canes, Fenrir jested once more, stating that, unlike certain others, swordplay was not among his interests. Rosaline, aggrieved, deliberately turned her back on him. Her response drew a sense of amusement from Fenrir, but the light in his eyes faded as he caught sight of a shadow lingering outside the window. A stranger, unknown to them, fixed his gaze on Fenrir with focused curiosity. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper prepared to unveil Rosaline's awaited items. Splendid canes, exuding a refined elegance, truly flawless by any measure. Glancing over the selection, Rosaline commented that the craftsmanship was carried out with admirable skill. Yet the Duchess hoped for a plainer style, and the proprietor quickly produced a simple wooden option lacking metal embellishments. Imagining a unique cane, the host enticed Rosaline, insisting that it would perfectly suit her. He then offered her a tidy wooden case, within which rested a humble yet lovely cane. He recounted that such versions were not originally crafted, but after a particular client, much experimentation took place. With courtesy, the shopkeeper invited Rosaline to examine this specific cane. Cradling it, the Duchess remarked that it felt lighter than solid wood might suggest, and was broader than the usual type. Rosaline seemed about to inquire further, but the proprietor merely awaited her reaction. Then, the young woman tugged upon a section of the cane. With that simple motion, what seemed an ordinary cane became, instantly, a gleaming sword. As Rosaline revealed the blade, the shopkeeper exclaimed joyfully, his pride in the object plain to hear. He shared how the earlier patron was training with the blade as well, which led him to design this piece with the Duchess in mind. Rosaline, her tone tinged with regret, confessed the cane was truly splendid. Yet, as she returned the sword to secrecy, she mentioned that she no longer wielded such weapons. Amazed, the shopkeeper instantly suggested crafting a personalized cane for Rosaline, to which she consented eagerly. It was then that a sharp, resounding noise rose up from below. The Duchess and the shopkeeper instantly grew uneasy, unable to comprehend what was unfolding around them. Rosaline's first instinct was a sharp dread that some misfortune had befallen Fenrir. With sudden urgency, she flung the door wide and rushed down the stairs. She flew down, skipping steps with the agile haste of worry. Reaching the bottom, Rosaline anxiously called Fenrir's name. Yet there was no trace of him below. A scene of disorder greeted her, as though there had been a struggle. The shop's door gaped open, admitting rain, its drops the only interruption to the building's heavy quiet. All the while, the city carried on. Tradesmen vied for attention, and townsfolk moved purposefully through the damp. Soaked through, Rosaline folded her arms tightly and gazed forlornly at the bare wall before her. The shopkeeper, eyeing the Duchess with worry, invited her to sit near the hearth to avoid falling ill. Mopping rainwater from her cheeks, Rosaline insisted that nothing was amiss. A few hours earlier, the Duchess had spared no effort in her search for Fenrir. Although the weather roared, she paid it no heed. All that mattered was being reunited as soon as possible. The shopkeeper deeply lamented that the girl's attempts to find the young man had proven fruitless. Though Rosaline appeared hollow and broken, turmoil and worry for Fenrir churned within her heart. The young man had vanished utterly, leaving no sign, gone as if swallowed by air itself. Minutes slid by, and the downpour grew fiercer, splattering muddy puddles across the way. Rosaline lingered inside the shop, quietly waiting for any sign. Her arms hugged her torso as she struggled to maintain a composed exterior. She stared toward the entrance unwaveringly, with only the rhythmic sound of the clock for companionship. A knight, familiar to Rosaline, entered to bring what news he could. With faint hope in her eyes, she inquired if there was any word of Fenrir, but the knight regretfully told her the search led nowhere. Rosaline let out a weighted breath and pressed her weary head into her hands. She had rallied more than 10 knights throughout the capital for the search. Their lone lead pointed to a woman with whom the missing youth had once crossed paths. She mentioned her desire to bring him back with her, yet he bolted off in an instant. Tracking him down would prove difficult, for Fenrir had a real talent for vanishing. Rosaline mused privately that it might actually be safer for him if she didn't discover his whereabouts. Even so, the Duchess's mind was shadowed by fear, haunted by the idea that someone might have snatched him away. Pushing those anxious thoughts aside, the young woman recalled the lady's assurance the youth was wandering alone. What eluded her, though, was where he could possibly have disappeared to. Fenrir had knowledge of but two homes, Rosaline's residence and Morin's, and sadly, the route leading back to the estate was lost to him. She speculated he could have sought out Maureen, yet there had been no word from her, prompting Rosaline to decide to pay her a visit herself. Just then, her thoughts were broken by the shop owner, who offered her some tea to help chase away the chill. The shopkeeper proffered a steaming cup and sought to allay her worries, insisting the youth would be found before long. Yet with her hands wrapped around the warm cup, Rosaline only felt the cold increase in her heart, overcome with the vision of Fenrir shivering out there by himself. After a moment's contemplation, the Duchess made up her mind to help with the search, but the knight hastened to urge her not to. He pointed out that another walk through the rain could bring illness upon Rosaline. His words elicited a look of irritation from the girl. Caught in her disapproving gaze, the knight fell silent at once, feeling suddenly unable to speak. Their focus shifted instantly when the shop's door swung open. A second knight entered the threshold, bringing with him a man found loitering in the alley. He confessed to having taken Fenrir. Immediately growing anxious, the stranger glanced nervously around the room. Rosaline regarded the newcomer sharply, judging him in silence. Without hesitation, she quickly closed the distance between them. Catching the man by his collar, the girl left him bewildered, questioning what was happening. With little preamble, the Duchess abruptly thrust his head against the wall, causing a pained gasp to escape him. Fixing him with a fierce stare, Rosaline demanded to know what he had done with Fenrir. The man, gripped by terror, remained voiceless and unmoving. When no answer came, Rosaline delivered a sharp blow to his side, showing no gentleness. Agonizing pain washed over the stranger, draining the color from his cheeks. Watching this unfold, both the shopkeeper and a knight nearby found themselves speechless with shock. Finally, the unfamiliar man spoke up, explaining with regret that he hadn't realized the Duchess was the beloved of the young fellow. Without hesitating, Rosaline delivered another blow, this time landing squarely on his chin. The girl's unexpected strength was overwhelming, and her strike drew a scattering of crimson. Recoiling in anguish, the man collapsed painfully to the ground. Not a soul inside the shop dared break the fraught silence. With one boot pressing upon him, Rosaline repeated her inquiry about Fenrir, her tone cool yet fearsome. To this, the startled stranger cried that he hadn't taken Fenrir anywhere, that the latter had bolted unexpectedly, and he had merely followed what was ordered. Rosaline observed him soundlessly, a flicker of disdain passing over her features. As the Duchess withdrew her foot, he gasped deeply, fighting to breathe. Rosaline turned to the knight, inquiring where the suspect had been located, and received a reply that the place was close by, but it was possible the youth had gone unnoticed. The Duchess guessed Fenrir might have lost his way returning. An urgent notion instantly dawned upon her. She informed the knights that the fellow was likely part of a group, and said that every member must be caught. Rosaline declared they were to extract any details necessary, even if it required using stern measures. She turned apologetically to her host, explaining she must remain another night in hopes the youth would find his way back. Entrusting the safekeeping of the merchant to the knights, Rosaline set her mind to embark on her search. Recalling the Duchess' own suggestion that Fenrir might still return, the knight conscientiously urged her to stay behind. Asked simply to wait, Rosaline gently reasoned that perhaps the youth was under someone's watchful gaze or frightened of armed men and could not escape. Still, the knight maintained that he ought not to venture out into the rain. Unfazed, Rosaline assured him she would make use of an umbrella. Seeing her resolve could not be swayed, the knight and the master of the shop watched after her as she went. The rain continued softly falling from the lavender-tinted heavens, casting the rooftops in a silver-tinted shroud. Ignoring the drizzle, Rosaline strode with certainty into the square. Hidden beneath her umbrella, the Duchess scanned her surroundings with care. Her gaze narrowed, focusing keenly on the place where the brigand had been discovered. Afterward, she inspected the spot where the woman and Fenrir had crossed paths. The solitary trail guided the girl toward one of the city's most obscure corners. She recollected that by continuing along this route, the city's perimeter would eventually come into view. Rosaline swiftly recognized that this particular path was quite familiar to the young man. It was, in truth, the very road that led back to the Duchess's grand residence. As they had entered the city, Fenrir often gazed out through the window, possibly passing time or taking in the sights. Nevertheless, perhaps he held a separate intention altogether. Without musing for long, the girl resolved to follow this way, her heart hoping she might catch up with the young man. Street upon street slipped by under her feet, yet Fenrir remained missing, his trace lost. Rosaline recalled his tendency to ascend to higher ground when uneasy, leaving only one likely spot: the city park cloaked in trees like a woodland. Indeed, in stark contrast to the city's bare buildings, the leafy park made the perfect refuge. It would be safer to return by carriage to the mansion, since Fenrir would recollect the emblem upon its side. The pursuit brought the girl to a towering, vibrant tree. Peering closer, she found Fenrir curled silently on a swelling branch above. Looking straight at him, the Duchess summoned his name. Upon hearing Rosaline's voice, the young man turned around at his own slow pace. The Duchess, with composure, requested he climb down and encouraged a return home. She promised his safety, explaining the one pursuing him had been apprehended. Yet the young man replied that for him, true safety did not exist, as he had been born this way. Remorse spread gently over the Duchess's features. A vague discomfort settled in Rosaline. She realized things were unchanged from before. With sorrow, Fenrir continued that no matter where his journey led, each place brimmed with peril, for the people never differed. Since residing with Rosaline, he'd hesitated to appear in public, but the girl nevertheless guided him on strolls. Regret raised her voice as she admitted to Fenrir that she had been overly trusting, yet he answered it was not her wrongdoing, as it mattered little if she handed the untamed half-beast to another. Neither the seller nor the buyer cared about his background, his nationality, or whether he even had anyone to return to. Throughout all of this, the only thing that truly mattered was the exchange of coin. Those who purchased people like Fenrir into servitude, seizing them and locking them away in a dark cellar until they matured, imprisoning them completely. At that time, Rosaline was struck by the memory of how Fenrir gazed forlornly from the mansion's windows. With his eyes swimming in tears, the youth confessed that he felt as if he wasn't truly growing up. Even if he were to remain at Morin's, as a child, he would never taste the freedom beyond those walls again. Fenrir felt convinced that he would never find any place in the world where he belonged, and yet, it was Rosaline's home that he recalled with a gentle glow in his chest. He shared with her that this time, rather than hiding away, he dreamed of returning to her instead. Rosaline, eyes reflecting sorrow, responded softly, "It isn't so terrible to have somewhere you can always return to. After all, you're free to leave and come home as you wish," and she had known that from the moment she offered Fenrir refuge. Although Fenrir was deeply hesitant to part from her, Rosaline couldn't bear to see him endangered. Should fate take her, she couldn't shelter him anymore. With aching sadness, Fenrir pleaded softly for her not to say such a thing, adding in a hush that, should anything happen to her, he would rather follow her in death. His words filled the Duchess with a poignant mix of astonishment and sadness. Just then, she recollected a conversation she'd had with Nora while offering her some words of guidance. Nora had remarked that Quran folk defined their existence by their instincts. Not understanding this, Rosaline watched Nora rush to explain further. According to Nora, Qurans resembled children until finding a mate, making survival on their own especially hard. Once Quran matured, they devoted their life to their partner, even passing away together. Rosaline absorbed her words closely. Nora mused that Qurans seemed destined to shield their loved ones above all else. For such figures, kin meant all the world, but Fenrir had never tasted that bond and so, perhaps, felt emotionally hollow. In response, Rosaline teased, asking whether Nora had become a student of psychology. Nora insisted that psychology was far from the realm of fable. The Duchess failed to grasp the core of Nora's warning, for all Nora sought was to prevent Fenrir both from loneliness and being turned loose outside. Clasping Rosaline's hand, Nora explained that Rosaline mustn't only protect him, but show unwavering kindness and patience. She further remarked that she was prepared to stake her life for Rosaline. The Duchess responded that the chance had passed, noting how Nora herself once swore the same to her before Nora's swift kick proved otherwise. With a snort, Nora reminded her that she was only 7 then and questioned why these trivial memories mattered at all right now. Returning to the topic, the woman clarified that she wouldn't lay down her life for Rosaline if her presence was lacking. When told not to draw boundaries between herself and Fenrir, Nora explained that offering shelter and encouragement should reassure the girl, but that it didn't mean someone couldn't enjoy life deeply. Back then, Rosalind couldn't quite grasp her point. Sure, she was right by instructing Fenrir. She believed that by taking this approach, the young man would learn to stand on his own, yet she hadn't paused to consider Fenrir's own desires. Observing him with quiet sorrow, the Duchess felt lost for words. As she called his name, Fenrir prepared to voice a thought. He inquired if she truly hadn't anticipated something like this. To that, Rosalind answered that she would simply pretend nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Her reply brought disappointment to the young man's face, as if he'd quietly hoped for a different response. Pressing her fingertips to her brow in exasperation, the Duchess strove to keep her thoughts away, not truly knowing what her next step should be. Then she informed the young man that as soon as he was ready, they would depart for home. In answer, Fenrir watched her in silence, hands wrapped tightly around his cap, holding it to his face. Rosalind explained that once he met a partner, growth would naturally follow. Her introductions to other half-beasts were not attempts to be rid of him, but acts of care. He in turn asked what might occur after this encounter, to which Rosalind responded that he would discover a companion and a sense of kinship. Holding onto the fabric of his coat, the young man muttered under his breath, so faintly that she wouldn't notice her words pained him. Receiving no reply, the Duchess began to muse about what could be passing through his mind. It struck her that Fenrir was retreating emotionally from her. Without another word, the young man agilely leapt down from the tree. Fenrir rose upright, refusing to meet Rosalind's gaze. She reached out to him, suggesting softly that they head for home. With a melancholy glance at her offered hand, Fenrir hesitated, not yet ready to reach back. But after a pause, he tenderly extended his hand toward the Duchess and accepted hers. Shrouded by the relentless curtain of rain, their carriage sped through the storm toward the great house. With her arm beneath her, Rosalind gazed serenely at Fenrir. The young man himself drifted into a gentle slumber the moment they entered the carriage. Rosalind understood that he was surely worn out from all that had occurred. The girl meant to softly lay a hand upon him. Yet her intention was disrupted by the coachman, who announced their arrival at the estate. Warm light spilled from the manor's grand windows, lending a sense of shelter and comfort amid the damp weather. Outside the carriage, the butler received the Duchess, addressing his mistress with news that a hot bath had been prepared for her. The lady commented that such words were the loveliest greeting. As she made efforts to gently rouse the sleeping Fenrir, she mused it would also be thoughtful to ask the chef for her companion's favorite fare. Nonetheless, her tries were in vain, for Fenrir offered no response. Rosaline at once grew pale, struck by worry. Lifting him into her arms, the girl called his name again and again. Beads of perspiration slid down Fenrir's temple, his cheeks flushed with heat. Upon closer inspection, she discerned his temperature was dangerously high, and his body swollen. Bursting from the carriage cradling him, Rosaline instructed the butler to fetch Nora at once. That evening, unrest swept through the household. All day, upon news of Fenrir's absence, a heavy gloom settled over the manor's corridors. And to encounter the young gentleman laid low by illness was enough to shadow any face with sorrow. Rosalind sought insight from the healer who arrived regarding the young man's affliction. Still, the physician could not provide a definite answer to his condition. The Duchess sought clarification. Had not Fenrir caught a chill from being drenched in the rain? The medical man assured her he would administer a fever remedy, but noted Fenrir's state must remain carefully watched. Rosaline kept her silence, gripping her own head in anxious agitation. A maid approached quietly, as if yearning to share a thought with her mistress. The girl observed that her brother once suffered from pneumonia showing the same signs, and a few days later he lost his life. Upon hearing this, the Duchess was overcome with dread, shunning even the thought of such a tragedy. With fatigue weighing on her voice, she instructed everyone present to leave. The butler spoke softly, advising that should the Duchess remain by his side, illness might befall her as well. Rosaline responded once more, her tone steady as she reaffirmed her directive. Respectfully inclining, the butler prepared to exit. He seemed poised to utter one last sentiment, but Rosaline gently requested his silence. She then laid her hand upon Fenrir's tousled hair, and he, feeling her touch, quietly acquiesced. Surprise flickered briefly in the girl's expression at this response. A slight tremulous smile touched her lips, though Rosaline looked as though she was battling back her tears. Nightfall found the Duchess still keeping vigil within the young man's quarters. Remaining at his side, she watched over him with gentle diligence. It pained Rosaline greatly to witness him in such a suffering state. His body was racked by fits until morning broke. Though he was given medicine, Fenrir's condition only continued to fade. As the clock struck midnight, the youth started to cry out. When he regained consciousness, he wept from agony before succumbing again to darkness. It had been many days since the messenger had ridden out to Nora, yet still not a word had returned. Fenrir grew burning hot with fever, his body radiating as though set alight. The healer administered every remedy in his knowledge, yet could offer no assurances as to Fenrir's recovery. Rosaline found herself disheartened by these uncertain words. Raising her voice, the Duchess vented her frustration that the fever would not abate, reminding the healer of her expectations when she engaged his service. Regret etching into his features, the healer cautioned that without lessening the fever, a grave turn could ensue. Rosaline listened in rapt unease as he explained the risk. Fenrir's mind might suffer deeply, or he might be left unable to move for life. The young man's fever raged fiercely. Even the healer could not truly say what would happen next. Weighed down by thoughts of disaster, the Duchess quietly inquired if there was anything more that could be done. Rosaline understood that the issue wasn't merely that Fenrir was drenched through. Moreover, the mistake lay in not stopping at the closest inn as soon as she saw it, rather than hurrying straight to the manor. The Duchess reproached herself for dragging him outside for a stroll he hadn't wished to take, failing to watch over him as she should have. She spoke softly of her memories, recollecting out loud her very first journey from the imperial palace with Nora when she was only a child. It was the first time Rosaline had ever departed the palace, and yet Nora had assured her it would bring joy. The ambiance during that walk differed from what she knew at the manor, and Rosaline found herself appreciative of it. Perhaps she delighted in the outing because at that moment, she held a tasty treat in her hand. Down the street she and Nora had wandered, when a feline trailed close behind. A frail, soot-colored kitten watched them with wide yellow eyes. Part of Rosaline wished merely to overlook it entirely. Nonetheless, Nora turned into the alley and shared her meal with the creature as Rosaline looked on in silence. Worried over the tiny animal surviving alone outdoors, Nora fretted, prompting Rosaline to offer it shelter and choose the name Fenrir. In maturity, she realized her action came more from a wish to impress Nora, her only friend, rather than pure kindness. Rosaline contemplated that the young man might be annoyed if he learned his namesake was once a kitten. At first, the mischievous kitten irritated her a touch, though later affection grew between them. The maids tended him while Rosaline and Nora would visit, the latter often joining in to play. A year passed, and one day Fenrir rejected his meal. Rosaline assumed it was simply the result of oppressive heat. Since the kitten adored food meant for people, Rosaline placed him atop the table and planned to share a piece of bread with him. Unfortunately, however, he perished. The child remembered that instant with painful clarity, a deep wound to her young heart. She recalled with horror how the dying creature coughed up blood onto her hands before promptly passing away. From that moment, Rosaline could not bring herself to cradle a baby. Later, she learned poison tainted that piece of bread. The cook and attendant maids were seized by the authorities. The Duchess reasoned that perhaps either her mother or brother gave the order, since only they harbored motives to harm her so. After this, a maid approached, telling her that Fenrir had given his life in exchange for her own, showing gratitude for the shelter Rosaline had provided. In her youth, Rosaline found these words harsh, believing it was, after all, just a kitten. A kitten who likely never thought himself a hero. All he longed for was a safe place to rest and something to eat. The young girl mused that by never adopting him, it's not as though his life on the streets would have been much longer. Yet at heart, she had simply aimed to impress her one friend, being merely a child herself. Time had brought a transformation to Rosaline. Now, the fear that someone might lose their life on her account haunted her deeply. Afterward, it seemed as though Rosaline reached her breaking point, abandoning her exercises altogether. The fools did nothing but poke fun at her peculiar ways. Their accusations of cowardice were effortless, and Rosaline held no grudge against them. When the Duchess concluded her speech, a heavy hush settled over the room, disturbed only by the steady ticking of the clock. As she found her voice once more, the young woman offered Fenrir an apology for bestowing that name upon him. She regretted just as much that she had dismissed his care as being insignificant. Meaningfully searching Fenrir's gaze, Rosaline accepted that she was unworthy of that particular burden. Resting her palm over the youth's heart, she faintly muttered that, no matter the plea, she would never subdue anyone else again. And should Fenrir ever pass, she envisioned laying him to rest within the manor's grounds he loved beyond words. She couldn't guess whether he found comfort in that future, but the young man offered no reply either. Pressing his hand within her own, Rosaline made up her mind to voice one last thought before night claimed her. Leaning close until their faces nearly touched, she confided anxiously that she would stay with him, come what may. Dawn cast its golden beams through the window. Rosaline lay beside Fenrir, her hand entwined with his as she drifted off. Gradually awakening, Fenrir became aware again, burdened by an unusual weight where he lay. At the sight of Rosaline sharing the bed with him, he was utterly stunned. For the briefest instant, Fenrir detected an odd sensation come over him. Rising upright, he agitatedly inspected his hands and arms for answers. Suddenly, he shot up and rushed towards the sunlight near the window. His eyes widened in astonishment as his reflection revealed a grown man's visage. Touching his own features, Fenrir marveled at the transformation, not recalling any previous hints of it. Just then, Rosaline awoke and a fretful tension spread across Fenrir's face. Rosaline gazed in shock at this unfamiliar man before her, while Fenrir was utterly speechless. Reacting instinctively, the girl grasped her cane, moving with impressive speed. In an instant, she aimed her trusty staff directly at his head. Fenrir barely managed to evade the object that was fired from her cane. Casting a glance back to the glass, he glimpsed a fresh fracture weaving through the window frame. Fenrir recalled that the glass was protected by enchantments. The sheer force of Rosaline's abilities terrified him. Had he failed to evade her, his fate would likely be sealed. As the youth weighed his options, Rosaline swiftly narrowed the gap dividing them. Acting without hesitation, she caught him off guard with a swift move, sending Fenrir crashing to the ground. With nimble hands, the girl withdrew a concealed blade hidden within her cane and pressed it menacingly against his neck. Seated astride him, Rosaline drew her face closer to his, shouting fiercely as she demanded to know Fenrir's whereabouts. The young man shrank with dread, and the Duchess glared at him, her gaze full of rage. He lifted his hands in assurance, softly stating that he was indeed Fenrir. Confused, Rosaline questioned what kind of joke this could be. Peering deeply into his eyes, she saw unmistakably that Fenrir was truly before her. Just then, from beyond the room, the butler's voice echoed, announcing Lady Eleanor's arrival at the estate. Noticing Rosaline's attention waver, Fenrir resolved to seize her blade. Catching hold of her arm, he made an attempt to wrest the weapon from her grip. He then gathered himself upstairs, sweeping Rosaline to the floor with a determined maneuver. Hovering over her, Fenrir crossed her arms atop her chest, pinning down her weapon. Overcome with agitation, Rosaline cried out, demanding to know his identity. Fenrir replied by urging her to compose herself and have a proper conversation. Right then, Eleanor entered the room accompanied by the butler, both of them caught in sudden embarrassment. Spread before them was a tableau. A shirtless man poised above a woman who stared at the intruders as though startled mid-act. The butler discreetly cleared his throat, masking the unease, while Nora found herself at a loss for words. Only then did Rosaline fully grasp the appearance of the scene, a married lady underneath a blanket alongside an unfamiliar man. Without delay, she sent the young man reeling with a forceful punch to his stomach. Doubling up from the blow, Fenrir clutched himself, racked with pain. Perplexed, Nora bade everyone to pause for a moment. Directing her finger toward the youth, she declared with certainty that he was Fenrir. Her statement elicited surprise from the butler, and Rosaline grew even more mystified by the unfolding circumstances. In his altered state, Fenrir couldn't help but feel uneasy as more eyes settled upon him. Seeking to mask the flush rising to his cheeks, the youth quickly turned away. When his glance met Rosaline's once more, clarity dawned upon him in an instant. Maturity is reached only after discovering a companion. After some time, they exited the chamber, allowing the attendants to tidy the space. Making their way to the guest chamber, Nora cast an intense gaze on Fenrir. Rosaline pressed her lips together in dissatisfaction, wordless and brooding. Nora noticed the fever had faded from her, and Fenrir seemed unscathed. Longing to lay her hand on him once thereof, she was met by the young man's insistent withdrawal. Absorbed by his inner turmoil, Fenrir lingered mutely upon the sofa. Rosaline asked if he wished to share something, or if she should depart for now. Hearing no reply, she made several attempts, entreating him to converse with her. Fenrir, nevertheless, held fast to his silence. Summoning Eleanor with her as she left, Rosaline moved towards the door. With their departure, Fenrir remained in solitude with his own company. He maintained his quiet, face marked with worry, watching their retreat. A grim-faced Rosaline and an unsettled Nora emerged into the adjacent room. Settling back in her seat, the Duchess remained standing, letting silence linger. Then, seething with frustration, Rosaline swiftly struck a chair nearby with a fierce kick. The Duchess pondered the turn of events aloud, and Nora too voiced her agreement. Taking a place at the table, Rosaline suggested Fenrir might have been taken away, perhaps substituted by an impostor. "But we can't be certain yet," Eleanor reminded her. That being the case, Nora mused that even the scars upon his back may have been perfectly replicated, a truly unsettling notion. Releasing a weary breath, Rosaline buried her head in her hands, overwhelmed as she tried to comprehend all that had occurred. Nora offered that this ordeal was nothing Rosaline needed to feel accountable for, prompting the Duchess to ask her meaning. Eleanor clarified gently, pointing out how Fenrir never once sought Rosaline's approval, but instead fell hopelessly, if silently, in love. In reply, the young woman remarked that aside from Lucian's proposal, nothing had disturbed her quite as much. Nora inclined her head thoughtfully and questioned whether she truly despised the sensation called love to such an extent. Rosaline, taken aback, cried out for the lady not to utter those words, for only yesterday Fenrir had appeared as innocent as a child. Nora, unfazed, stretched out her arms and observed that it was merely a surface impression, remarking that the boy's ears and tail had vanished, and he resembled an ordinary human now. Eleanor chimed in too, stating that Fenrir's swift victory over Rosaline proved he could defend himself, making it unnecessary for the girl to bear any responsibility for him. Taking in the Duchess's expression, Nora continued matter-of-factly that no harm would come to the youth if left alone in a bustling city. Rosaline inquired when she had become so indifferent. Nora explained that initially she viewed the matter as balancing the child's well-being with the girl's peace of mind, but circumstances had shifted since then. Eleanor pointed out that entering into a relationship with a man out of sympathy would only disturb Rosaline emotionally. The Duchess sought an alternative explanation. Fenrir's abrupt shift into adulthood created a whirlwind of questions for both companions. Turning it over in her mind, Rosaline wondered if it wasn't her fault after all, but instead linked to overwhelming anxiety. Nora mentioned that, despite being uncommon, such instances had indeed occurred before. She explained to me that half-beasts matured by necessity when faced with peril beside their future partners. In those environs, concerns for personal survival overshadowed all else. It dawned on Rosaline when Eleanor noted that the Quran's attachment to their homeland was unbreakable, implying Fenrir had grown weary after such a prolonged journey. The girl passionately denied the romantic notion, speculating that the supposed affection stemmed only from being startled by his near abduction. Nora habitually believed that simply asking Fenrir would yield answers, a sentiment that caught the Duchess off guard. Acknowledging her surprise, Nora gently took the girl's hand to impart some reassurance. With quiet conviction, she urged Rosaline to directly inquire of Fenrir about his feelings, assuring her that clarity would follow. Those words caused the Duchess to flush with embarrassment. She pressed her lips together and refrained from replying. So Rosaline turned away, gazing sorrowfully through the window and addressing Nora with a mournful look. Eleanor observed in silence, waiting patiently to hear what Rosaline might say next. On the brink of tears, the Duchess questioned what would happen if she ended up spoiling Fenrir's future. She still struggled with the memory involving her kitten. Great fear gripped Rosaline that her actions might once more bring harm to someone. Darkness now blanketed the mansion's land, and by then, Eleanor's carriage had arrived at the gates. After seeing Nora out, Rosaline, remaining by the window of the manor, called softly for the butler. Facing him, she requested that a tailor be summoned to adjust the youth's clothing and that a selection of ready-made suits be ordered for his use. Recalling the inconvenience she had brought upon the cane shop owner, the girl also requested that a servant be dispatched there. Rosaline, gazing wordlessly through the window, summoned her resolve to head into the dining hall. Upon stepping into the hallway, the girl pushed the doors wide and acknowledged that one cannot stay away from a fellow resident merely due to unease. Fenrir was already seated at the table, his attention immediately drawn the moment the Duchess appeared. Though a bit anxious, the young man stared at her directly, his gaze unwavering. Standing in the corridor in a slight daze, Rosaline inhaled softly and made to proceed further. She strolled calmly by Fenrir's spot, feeling his concerned eyes following her every movement. Settling herself carefully in her chair, she gently drew herself closer to the table. With spoon in hand, Rosaline softly stated that the meal should now begin. When she tasted the first mouthful, she found herself mildly irritated by the sounds of clinking tableware coming from Fenrir. She silently reasoned that any aristocrat in her situation would surely have been offended. Yet in comparison to his childish habits before, the differences stood out starkly. Observing him, the Duchess noticed how swiftly he was adapting. Despite the slight racket to her ears, she found the entire experience rather agreeable. Once merely a lively youngster, he now carried himself with a graceful refinement in his every gesture. Rosaline considered that some actions must have once been challenging for him due to his short arms, though now he seemed much more adept. Coming to this realization, Fenrir now appeared utterly remote to her. As she examined him more closely, she struggled to identify any traces of the boy he had once been. In the end, only the shade of his hair remained from before. That gentle, sun-kissed skin seemed to hold a memory of warmth, and his striking yellow eyes, where a quiet, ardent glow still burned. When Fenrir felt Rosaline's gaze, he returned her look openly. Lowering her face in bashfulness, the girl felt a tremor of anxiousness. She soon rose from the table and, offering an apology, mentioned she needed to depart. It suddenly felt unbearably close in the room, and beads of perspiration began to slip down her cheeks. She moved toward the doorway with tranquility, her steps taking her past Fenrir. The youth halted her progress by gently seizing her arm. Pausing to collect his words, he fixed her with a silent, contemplative gaze. Rosaline grew still more anxious. Her pulse quickened perceptibly. Fenrir maintained his subtle grip, tenderly tracing the top of her hand with his thumb. Then, his gaze unwavering and fixed on hers, he spoke her name with purpose. This caused the girl even greater discomfort, flushing her cheeks with shyness. With sudden and somewhat harsh motion, Rosaline pulled her hand free. She remarked that Fenrir could finish his food, as she wished instead to retreat upstairs and relax. Already walking briskly, the girl made for the exit. Thus, Fenrir remained seated, alone with his ruminations. Climbing to her chamber, the girl decided to indulge in a soothing bath. She couldn't comprehend why her heartbeat thudded relentlessly within her chest. The night before, Rosaline had braced herself for any outcome regarding Fenrir's affliction. Whatever might result, she was determined to shield him. Yet the healer's foretellings failed to come about. The young man recovered fully, spared even lingering wounds. Fenrir simply matured, making his choice on whom to walk beside all his days. Undoubtedly, when set against worse possibilities, this conclusion was extraordinary. Now in robust health, Fenrir possessed the physique that had so long occupied his dreams. Indeed, one could call it a blissful resolution. Still, the slightest recollection of Fenrir left Rosaline unsettled. With his transformed appearance, the young man looked truly striking and commanding. Rosaline clearly realized she would not be able to steer clear of Fenrir forever. Despite this, the girl continually tried to find vestiges of the child he once was, hidden within. Yet she understood it brought only unease to herself and surely to him. With a pang, Rosaline thought herself lacking. Neither a steadfast protector nor a nurturing instructor. The gentle glow of the moon slid in through the bedroom windows, painting the floor in cool, silvery hues. Rosaline gazed through the window as if searching for a glimpse of optimism. The moonlight, looming above the manor, bathed the estate in a pale brightness, as though turning night into milky daylight. Bundled in her blanket, the Duchess made up her mind to step out, having struggled to find rest. In the garden, the young lady noticed an immaculately arranged stone bench. Finding comfort on it, Rosaline allowed herself to drift into her own reflections. With weary hands holding her brow, the Duchess acknowledged the night was destined to feel endless. She resolved to linger a short while in the cool air of the garden before retiring indoors once more. Then, all at once, she caught the faint shuffle of leaves somewhere behind her. Twisting around, she sensed by the distinct tread that someone, or something, followed with intent, stirring her suspicion of an assassin. Rosaline's nerves grew taut, even though she had taken her sword along. Out of the shrubbery, a broad, beastly paw broke through. As it fully revealed itself from concealment, the creature pierced her with a keen, hungry gaze. Rosaline could not fathom why such an enormous brute prowled her garden. Dread washed over her as she prepared to face her fate. It seemed to her that someone had let the murderous animal slip into her realm on purpose, disguising disaster as accident. Meanwhile, the fearsome presence approached steadily, moving with unhurried resolve. The memory of the nearby Knights' training hall sparked a wish in Rosaline to flee for shelter there. Yet fear bound her in place, motionless, and the animal simply halted, sitting quietly beside her. Trying to rise yet again, she discovered her legs resisted every command. The beast cocked its head, peering at her as if bewildered. Then, with quiet assurance, it nestled Rosaline's head gently in its lap. Realization came when she caught the soft, adoring look in its eyes, reminiscent of a tender feline. Despite her lingering apprehension, she hesitantly inquired if he was Fenrir. Still moving cautiously near him, Rosaline restated her question, seeking confirmation. With a crease between his brows, he glanced at her, puzzled by her repeated inquiry. It dawned on Rosaline that only Fenrir could be so gently untroubled in her presence. Thus, with composed grace, she reached out to gently caress him. The young lady teased, reminding him that he hadn't always been such a kitten. In response, Fenrir turned away with a rebellious air, leaving Rosaline to wonder if her words had pierced his feelings. Observing more closely, the Duchess silently remarked she'd never encountered such a creature. Fenrir had a feline form, but boasted the stature of a lion. His entire body shimmered with the brilliant gloss of jet-black fur, almost dazzling to the eyes. Noticing his changes through the years, Rosaline inquired about any hidden talents he might possess. Fenrir responded with a silent shake of his head, denying it. Rosaline assumed that either such abilities were absent or Fenrir was simply unaware of them for now. Feeling comforted by Fenrir's presence in front of her, the Duchess ventured another affectionate gesture. She was entirely at peace beside him, an easy comfort enveloping her. Moments later, laughter escaped the girl as her thoughts wandered, Rosaline musing that Fenrir might just find her ridiculous if she spoke them aloud. Nevertheless, she confessed a memory of a children's tale where a heroine rode a lion instead of a steed. With his expression full of protest, Fenrir revealed his annoyance, and the Duchess quickly reassured him that her musings were merely passing thoughts, and she had no intention of riding him like a horse. Rosaline further admitted uncertainty as to whether he was even strong enough to carry a person. At her assessment, Fenrir took visible offense. With a sigh, he let his ears droop in sorrow. Then, as Rosaline watched him in confusion, he began to settle himself upon the ground. Catching on to his purpose, the girl asked hesitantly if his intentions were in earnest. Meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve, Fenrir seemed intent on disproving her doubts. Somewhat apprehensively, the girl gave her consent. As she carefully climbed atop him, Rosaline cautioned herself not to let Fenrir regret his decision. Settling delicately on Fenrir's great back, Rosaline prepared to climb down. Yet this new sensation kindled more excitement within her than she had anticipated. For a moment, she truly felt like the heroine within a once-beloved fairy tale. As she fondly stroked Fenrir again, the Duchess quietly observed just how utterly captivating he was, even as she began to slide from his back. But Fenrir had different intentions. He bolted ahead with breathless swiftness. Rosaline clung to him, barely keeping her seat, for his speed rivaled that of a rushing gale. With agile grace, Fenrir leaped over every barrier, taking the girl farther from the grand house with each bound. The rapid pace unsettled Rosaline. Fear tightening her throat, the girl let out a terrified cry. Yet suddenly her gaze caught the splendor of the night sky under a radiant full moon. Her fright melted away, replaced instead by a deep appreciation for the forest's bewitching allure. Under a canopy sequined with stars, the moon's silvery glow painted the flora, and the whole world seemed filled with wonder. Their journey paused on the banks of a gentle lake, embraced on all sides by luxuriant woods. Fenrir eased his stride, strolling peacefully down to the edge of the shimmering waters. Quite suddenly, Rosaline, perched atop his back, found herself tumbling downward. After coming to rest upon the earth, the girl was motionless for several moments. Fenrir hovered above with anxious circles, uneasy that she might have been hurt. But all at once, Rosaline stirred, showing she was unharmed. Spread upon the grass, she broke into laughter, its sound innocent and pure as a child's. Fenrir's brow furrowed, but then he sighed, relief softening his features. Rosaline assured him warmly, explaining she'd only toppled over. Trying to regain composure, she confessed these emotions were a rarity in her recent life. The Duchess glanced around, realizing they had ventured deep within the woods, and with joy noticed the fireflies twirling about her. Turning toward Fenrir, she inquired if he had chosen this haven especially for her. Rosaline admired the magical charm of their surroundings with wonder. Checking her simple attire, she remarked with a laugh that never before had she roamed such distant paths in nothing but her nightclothes, and then she faced Fenrir, her lips curling into a delighted smile. Without her realizing, the youth quietly transformed back into his human shape. Rosaline's eyes widened, genuine astonishment filling her expression. Gazing at her with tenderness, he spoke her name with gentle affection. Soon after, he traced her cheek with a tender caress, his fingers gliding over her fragile skin. Moved by a sudden impulse, Fenrir gradually inclined toward Rosaline, their lips meeting in a gentle touch that spoke of unspoken vows. His warm breath brushed her cheek, sending her heart fluttering deeply within her chest. Bathed in the enchanting glow of the moon, their inaugural kiss blossomed, brimming with passion and affection. Time slowed during their embrace, surrendering to gentleness, care, and an unspeakable sense of closeness woven in perfect silence.